Hey guys, picture this. You're sneaking through moonlit battlements, hearts pounding louder than the clatter of armored guards, only to discover your true love is betrothed to a rival warlord, and death is the only alternative to giving up that forbidden kiss. That's right, medieval romance wasn't all candlelit sonnets and chivalric banners. Sometimes it was more like smuggling secret love letters in your codpiece and crossing your fingers you weren't impaled for indecency. Before you get comfortable, please hit like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do. Drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's dive together into today's journey. In the dank heart of 13th century Flanders, Lady Isabeau de Montclair awoke to the shriek of crows and the distant clamor of a blacksmith's hammer. Her alabaster cheeks, normally composed behind the fortress walls of her family's keep, were damp with tears she dared not admit. You see, Isabeau was hopelessly in love with her family's prisoner, a handsome Welsh minstrel named Owen ap Glyn. To her father, he was nothing more than a trespassing troubadour, an irritating interloper who'd strummed bawdy ballads under the moonlight in exchange for scraps of bread. To Isabeau, he was a forbidden melody, each verse pulling her closer to ruin. By day, Isabeau practiced the stiff etiquette expected of a noblewoman, curtsying without fainting, reciting Latin prayers she barely understood, and enduring endless fittings for the looming betrothal to the Duke of Brabant, a man who smelled of pickled herring and political ambition. By night, she crept into the tower where Owen was confined, exchanging hushed promises through iron bars. His fingers, calloused from plucking lute strings, would trace impossible shapes on her fingertips, sketching dreams of escape in the gloom. Each stolen moment crackled with absurd tension. One misstep, and the Duke's guards would snap the tower door shut, sealing both their fates. But the absurdity of survival in medieval courts is that love often moved faster than rumor mills. Word spread of secret rendezvous, a candle left burning in the corridor when it should have been extinguished, a rose petal pressed between two stones in the garden wall. When Isabeau's mother, the formidable Countess Adele, discovered the petals, her heart hardened as if forged in a warhammer. She plotted to break Owen's spirit, nightly servings of stale bread soaked in foxglove-infused broth, meant to shatter his health and his resolve. Meanwhile, Isabeau was forced to attend lavish feasts, her laughter ringing false as she watched her beloved's health wilt like autumn leaves. One moonless night, Owen revealed his desperate plan. He had bribed a stable hand to sneak them out on horseback toward the marshes bordering Ghent. They would travel under the cloak of darkness until the Flemish countryside gave way to free air and distant safety. The catch? They'd need Isabeau's jewelry, her mother's pearl necklace and the ruby brooch from her wedding dowry, to pay for passage across the sea to Wales. Stripping away her noble identity meant forever severing ties with home, family, and everything she'd known since birth. But the idea of living a single day apart from Owen was more terrifying than exile. As they crept down the spiraling staircase, their shadows dancing grotesque shapes against the stone walls, they heard the snap of a branch outside, the Duke's hunting party roused by fresh gossip. Isabeau's heart might have exploded from the adrenaline. She clutched Owen's arm so tightly his blood drained from his fingers. "Keep your voice silent," he whispered, "and trust in the wind." But fate, ever a mischievous jester, intervened. A stray spark from the torches flickered across a puddle of oil left by a careless guard, igniting a fiery hiss that echoed through the tower. Alarms bellowed, guards poured into the corridor, their gleaming pikes aimed like accusing fingers. Owen pushed Isabeau into a recess in the wall, whisked off her cloak and tied it around her waist. Even now she didn't know if it was to blindfold her or bind her arms. He kissed her with a ferocity born of doom, then ran. The guards surged forward, their torches awakening ancient inscriptions on the cold stones. Isabeau remained hidden, her breath ragged, while her world collapsed into the glow of orange flames and the clamor of betrayal. By dawn, the courtyard was flooded with rumors and curses. The Duke's men found only the torn end of Isabeau's cloak snagged on the tower's iron grille. Owen's cell lay empty, the lock smoldering from the brazier he'd used to melt the hinges. Whispers spread that he'd sold his soul to a witch in exchange for their freedom. Others claimed he'd been swallowed by the marshes, lost forever. Isabeau's family forbade mention of his name. She was confined to her chambers, her bedsheets soaked with fever and longing. Yet sometimes, in the stillness before sunrise, Isabeau could hear a distant melody, somehow familiar, impossibly hopeful, drifting through the oak shutters. She knew in her bones it was Owen, traversing hidden paths, playing one final ballad for the woman who risked everything for love. And though the world branded their tale as folly, a cautionary legend of noble arrogance and peasant treachery, Isabeau clutched to that melody like a lifeline, convinced that history's absurd cruelty could never extinguish the wild spark of forbidden devotion. Meanwhile, across the channel in the crumbling walls of Dover Castle, a more grotesque romance unfolded. Lady Eleanor Fitzherbert, famed for her sharp tongue and extravagant gowns, found herself ensnared by the castle's stablemaster, a hulking Scot named Fergus MacAlpine. By daylight, he mucked out stalls and mended bridles. By midnight, he serenaded her in Gaelic, his voice laced with whiskey warmth and raw sincerity. Eleanor, whose family fortune depended on forging alliances with French dukes and Sicilian princes, knew this affair was political absurdity. A low-born horse handler, unthinkable, but Fergus, with a hay still clinging to his boots, held her gaze as if she were the only woman in Christendom. When he pressed an abandoned apple blossom to her lips, she tasted joy for the first time in a decade, spent sighing over ledger books and diplomatic dispatches. Their clandestine trysts took place in the hayloft, high above the horses' snorts and the stable rats' squeaks. The scent of straw mixed with Eleanor's perfumed skirts, an ironic tableau of filth and finery. Yet their laughter rang through the rafters as they plotted escape. A smuggled horse, a secret bribe to a passing merchant ship, the hope of a new life in the Scottish Highlands. It sounded like a bawdy ballad better suited for a tavern than the vaulted ceilings of Norman architecture. But, as any medieval romantic farce goes, betrayal lurks in the most mundane corners. A stable cat, intrigued by a loose silk ribbon, mewed a shrill alarm as it leaped from a haystack, toppling a lantern that set ablaze the loft. Flames licked at the beams, sending Fergus diving through a narrow window, and Eleanor stumbling behind him in her corseted bodice. They tumbled into the muddy courtyard, where soldiers, drawn by smoke and screams, seized them both. Eleanor's father, the Earl of Kent, faced a dilemma: marry his only daughter to a foreign prince or watch her hanged for consorting with a commoner. Unwilling to stain the family honor, he arranged a quick trial. Fergus, with bruised ribs and a broken lute, claimed noble blood in a tongue unfamiliar to the court, so foreign that no one understood his claim. Eleanor, in a gesture of desperate solidarity, declared she'd follow him to the gallows. The judges, exasperated by her stubborn defiance, exploited a loophole. Fergus would earn his pardon if he agreed to serve as a soldier in the Earl's own retinue until he saved enough coin to buy Eleanor's hand. Thus began their cruel twist of fate, forced to fight in skirmishes against marauding Welsh brigands by day, then steal kisses in the latrine by night. Eleanor learned to don a cuirass and wield a sword. Fergus discovered the art of letter writing in French courtly style. Their letters, sealed with wax and wrapped inside strips of leather, flew between camps like forbidden birds. Some nights, as they lay under tattered blankets, they whispered plans of bribery, escape, and a hopeful future in a monastery far from the prying eyes of Kent's court. The medieval world thrived on such absurd contradictions. Noble ladies turned warriors for love, stable hands recast as reluctant protectors of the realm. And amid this chaos, a third tale began to twist its way through the cold stone corridors of a Benedictine abbey in northern Italy. Sister Maria Benedetta, cloaked in white habit and bound by vows of chastity, took vows young and proud. Yet beneath her veil, her heart yearned for the Lorenzo de' Medici, a man so wealthy and esteemed that even the Pope envied his fortune. Lorenzo, visiting Florence on a pilgrimage, was captivated not by her vow of poverty, but by the glint of rebellion in her eyes, as she chastised him for flaunting jewels before the poor. Their conversations began at the abbey's refectory, where Sister Maria tossed a stale piece of bread at a fellow nun to distract her, then leaned forward to beckon Lorenzo closer. He, in turn, bribed the kitchen staff to slip him parchment and charcoal. They exchanged sonnets of sin and piety in the margins of a ledger, that catalogued alms for the needy. Each whispered declaration felt like a heresy, more dangerous than any plague. When the abbey's mother superior discovered ink-smeared manuscripts hidden in Maria's sewing kit, she demanded an explanation. Maria, undeterred, proclaimed that true devotion lay in the heart, not in vows alone. Lorenzo, summoned to the chamber, knelt amid polished stone floors and confessed his love in French, Italian, and Latin, any tongue that might pierce the nun's resolve. The Mother Superior, a woman renowned for her severity, decreed a cruel penance. Maria would be walled into a cell within the abbey walls for a fortnight, allowed nothing but bread and water, while Lorenzo was excommunicated until he renounced his love, or until he donated half his fortune to the church. History forgets whether his pockets or his heart emptied first. Some chroniclers claim Lorenzo donated the gold and continued to visit in secret, slipping morsels of olive bread through the mortar cracks. Others insist he rode off to fight in the Crusades, leaving behind only a single rose and a vow to return. These grotesque chronicles of love and lunacy remind us that medieval romance was less about sweet glances across banquet tables and more about outrunning torches, dodging inquisitions, and defying every absurd rule penned by paranoid patriarchs. And yet, through the fog of superstition and the grind of survival, these lovers carved fleeting moments of reckless joy, proof that even in the darkest ages the human heart refused to bow quietly to authority. Stay tuned for part 2, where we'll journey to the Moorish courts of Granada and explore an affair so scandalous it sparked a war and nearly got 2 poets impaled. In the sun-scorched courtyards of 15th century Granada, Nasira bint al-Mu'min and the poet Ibn Zaydun danced on the razor's edge of forbidden devotion. One glance, one misplaced syllable could ignite a conflict fiercer than any siege. Nasira, daughter of a respected courtier, lived beneath courtyards tiled with turquoise and pomegranate trees dripping ruby fruit. Ibn Zaydun, once a rising star in the Andalusian poetic firmament, had fallen from grace over a satirical ode that dared mock the emir's harem etiquette. Banished from court, he lurked in the library, ink-stained fingers trembling as he penned verses to the moon, until Nasira, bored by the endless parades of silk-clad concubines, slipped into a shadowed retreat. She arrived shrouded in a crimson veil, the scent of orange blossoms trailing her steps. "I heard you mock the emir's choices," she whispered, voice low enough only to stir the air between them. "I find no dishonor in speaking truth." His reply was a quill scratching parchment. "Truth is a hungry wolf. Feed it at your own peril." Their affair bloomed in clandestine scribbles, couplets folded inside false book covers, sweet as stolen almonds. At dusk, Nasira would slip from the palace walls on a borrowed mule, meeting Ibn Zaydun at the Alhambra's crumbling towers. The moon carved their silhouettes on ancient stones as he recited lines so sharp they cut through the thick air of conquest and religion. But rumors spread faster than caravans. A servant spotted her crimson veil beneath the minbar. An eunuch heard her laughter echo from the poet's scriptorium. The emir, maddened by suspicions, ordered both lovers seized. Ibn Zaydun was dragged from his fragrant cell and beaten with palm fronds until his poetry blurred into bloodied parchment. Nasira was confined to a golden cage, a tower with latticed windows that offered the sun but barred the wind. Between stone and sorrow, their bond intensified. Ibn Zaydun smuggled love letters and hollowed figs, their sticky sweetness preserving the ink. Nasira, forced to marry a distant cousin to secure an alliance with the Nasrid dynasty, refused every suitor's stallion in gift, her heart galloping only for words etched in fig residue. One night, as Granada's bells tolled for prayer, Ibn Zaydun hatched an escape. He would impersonate a Mamluk guard, steal the keys to Nasira's tower, and spirit her away under the guise of a midnight purge. She agreed. Though perched atop a parapet in silk slippers, she knew they would be torn to pieces by the emir's falcons if caught. Yet the absurdity of surviving meant embracing lunacy at the chance of love. Their plan unraveled when the emir's own falcon, trained to kill spies, swooped down and plucked the small pouch of keys from Ibn Zaydun's belt. The bird returned triumphantly to its master, talons clamped around the copper keys that jingled like vanquished dreams. In a fury, the emir had the falcon's eyes gouged out, lest any animal be complicit in human rebellion. Ibn Zaydun was exiled to Fez, his final poem written in tears. A heart unbound by chains still trembles in the desert wind. Nasira, her promise unfulfilled, was married off in a ceremony she refused to attend. She stood in shadowed chambers, her spirit as parched as the barren hills beyond Granada. Meanwhile, far to the east in the harsh borderlands of medieval Poland, Lady Katarzyna Lubomirska risked her fortune for a secret love that could tear kingdoms apart. Katarzyna, heiress to a vast estate of salted cod and timber, was promised to a Hungarian count twice her age in a match arranged for sugar trade routes. Yet her heart belonged to Mikołaj Zawisza, a roguish messenger boy whose fleet feet carried whispers and stolen kisses across icy forests. Each dawn, before the sun could scorch the frozen wood, Katarzyna would slip from her gilded bed, don a man's cloak, and mount one of her father's finest stallions. Under her borrowed disguise, she galloped to a hidden glade where Mikołaj awaited, breath pluming in the air like twin lanterns. They shared stolen morsels of rye bread and sips of mead, their laughter echoing amid towering pines, symbols of a love that defied every edict from the Vatican and the Hungarian crown. Word of their clandestine meetings reached Katarzyna's betrothed, the Count of Zemplén, who dispatched soldiers in fur-lined coats to capture her and drag her to Buda, there to endure a loveless life amid foreign minstrels and imported spices. Yet on the eve of her abduction, Mikołaj arrived, bearing forged documents that declared Katarzyna's marriage annulled, thanks to an obscure clause in canon law and a bribed clerk in Krakow. They fled north, crossing the Baltic in a fishing vessel bound for Visby, their supplies limited to smoked herring and a single barrel of mead. The deck pitched beneath them, and the wind screeched through rigging like a chorus of vengeful ancestors. Katarzyna clutched Mikołaj's hand as waves threatened to swallow them whole. An absurd baptism into freedom, baptized by salt and fear. In Visby, they assumed new identities. She became Kaja the spice trader, he Nils the shipwright. They prospered, trading fur for silks and learning to navigate merchant politics. But the Count's vengeance lingered. Bounty hunters tracked their every step, sundered only by changing tides and the shifting loyalty of harbor masters. Katarzyna, whose fingers once traced embroidery patterns, now bartered in negotiations laced with coded insults. Mikołaj became adept at forging seals and forging bets on dice games, each roll a prayer that their pursuers would drown in the Baltic's icy grip. Their sanctuary proved fleeting. On a chill dawn, as they loaded barrels onto a Hanseatic cog, the harbor erupted in violence. Mercenaries brandished pikes, shouting Katarzyna's true name. A skirmish ensued, barrels tumbled into the water, and the vessel lurched away, leaving them onshore amid clashing steel. Katarzyna, forced to flee once again, abandoned her trading license and seductively whispered the code word Visby into Mikołaj's ear, their only compass in a world that insisted they were criminals rather than lovers. Now, this pair wanders the northern isles, rumored among fishermen as the ghost traders, their legend spreading. Two star-crossed fugitives who survived cannibal winters and royal edicts, trading secrets for sanctuary until kingdoms forgot what the Rut had lost. Meanwhile, back in Western Europe, an even darker romance unfolded under the pall of the Black Death. In 1348, as plague carts rattled through the alleyways of Avignon, Sister Marguerite de Roquemaur's habit hid more than her vows. It concealed a heart wrenched by forbidden desire. Marguerite, once betrothed to a noble knight who died of fever, had taken the veil to escape grief. Yet in the plague-filled shadows she found solace in the arms of Dr. Etienne Chardin, a physician notorious for cutting open victims to tally their organs. Etienne moved among the sick with gloved hands and a curious detachment, cataloging symptoms with the zeal of a gold-hungry alchemist. Marguerite, delivering bread and water to the dying, observed him through the archways of the infirmary, struck by the way his tired eyes glowed beneath a dirt-smeared coif. Where others saw a gravedigger of hope, she saw a man whose hands trembled with compassion beneath layers of protective leather. One night she slipped into his makeshift laboratory, shelves lined with jars of pickled organs and bone dust, and whispered, "Do you fear death?" Etienne started, then laid aside his pestle. "Only when I hold its secrets too close." They spoke until dawn, their words weaving a fragile tapestry amid the stink of decay. Marguerite confessed her vow was a cage, Etienne admitted his science was a coffin of numbers. They kissed by candlelight, a desperate union of flesh and aspiration. But the Inquisition, sensing scandal in every rustle of habit, sent spies into the abbey cloisters. A novice stumbled upon their tryst in the chapel's crypt, her shriek echoing off tombstones carved with anguished faces. Marguerite was hauled before a tribunal of mitred bishops, her hands shackled in rosaries. Etienne, accused of heresy for saving lives on a Sabbath, was flogged publicly until his back carved a map of torment. Marguerite faced an agonizing choice: renounce her love and return to devotional silence, or follow Etienne into exile as a laywoman, with the added irony of wandering plague-ravaged roads together. She refused to abandon him. The tribunal, exasperated by her obstinacy, banished them both from Avignon. They set off into a Europe torn by disease, pushing a cart of medical herbs and relics, offering remedies for coin and shelter in monasteries that would accept them. Their journey became legend, two lovers defying church law and death itself, healing the sick by day and forging letters in the margins of prayer books by night, scribbling their story for posterity. By this point, you might be asking yourself, how did any of these lunatics survive? The answer is equally absurd. They didn't, at least not always, but their legacies persisted in whispered ballads, codex marginalia, and the feverish nightmares of distracted monks. In a world where survival meant skirting inquisitions, ducking falcon claws, and bargaining your honor for a handful of herbs, love became the most perilous alchemy of all. Stay tuned for part 3, where we'll spill into the courts of Scandinavia, uncovering a Viking shield maiden's romance with an Arab merchant that nearly toppled the Hanseatic League. In the gray dawn of a Scandinavian fjord, the roar of longships echoed against ice-slit cliffs as Brynhild, iron-braid Sigurd's daughter, hefted her battle axe with all the grace of a lumbering bear and all the dignity of a woman who knew her sword arm, was the only thing standing between her people and starvation. Brynhild, famed across the north for leading raiding parties into the tangled coasts of Frisia and the amber-rich rivers of Rus, never expected to fall in love. After all, she'd spent her youth training under hardened shield maidens, swearing oaths of celibacy in exchange for a lifetime of pillage and pillory. Then came Rashid al-Yamani, an Arab spice merchant whose single ship had drifted disastrously off course into the teeth of a snow squall. Rashid arrived in a battered dhow, its sails torn like the heart of a lovesick poet. He carried with him saffron, myrrh, and an optimism so bewildering it could have been contraband in any Norse court. When Brynhild's raiders boarded the vessel, they expected treasure or betrayal, but instead found a man calmly rehearsing his final prayers in Arabic. Brynhild, curious whether his faith endowed him with better paddle skills or merely better metaphors, ordered him brought before her. "Why do you barter spices in these frozen wastes?" she demanded, her voice as sharp as her axe's edge. Rashid bowed, offering her a small vial of crushed rose petals. "Because the world beyond these fjords smells of opportunity." That absurd notion, that a man could navigate commerce through sand and sea as skillfully as a shield maiden could navigate warfare, ignited something in Brynhild's breast. She kept him alive, mostly because she was sure the emir's bounty on his head would come in handy, but also because his tales of sunlit bazaars and night skies free of auroras felt like legends from another life. Their affair blossomed in secret. Rashid taught her the art of mixing perfumes, and Brynhild showed him the proper stance for a berserker charge. At night, they shared bread spiced with saffron and meat stolen from the royal boar. Each kiss tasted like rebellion, against Odin, against custom, and against the idea that a woman's heart was safe behind layers of chainmail. Word of their liaison reached Brynhild's council when Rashid's dhow reappeared, its hull plastered against the rocks. The jar of rose petals clutched in Brynhild's pouch had spilled under her tunic, its scent betraying her innocence. The chieftains demanded Rashid's head. Brynhild countered by challenging the strongest warrior to single combat for his freedom. The ensuing duel, fought atop the fjord's slippery rim, ended with Rashid's champion plunging into the icy water, and Rashid himself, dripping and delirious, pulling Brynhild into a sudden embrace that melted centuries of Norse stoicism in an instant. Fearing reprisals from chieftains and gods alike, Brynhild and Rashid fled under cover of a midnight storm, boarding a captured cog bound for the British Isles. Their departure sparked a brief civil war among the Vikings as each clan chose a side, steel to spice betrayal. Though their story nearly toppled alliances and sank fleets, it survives in sagas as the tale of Ironbraid's folly, and, to some romantics, her greatest victory. Deep within the Heian-era courts of 11th century Kyoto, Lady Narihime, famed for her porcelain skin and inscrutable poetry, eyed the horizon each dawn, not for the returning emperor but for Ikuma no Saburo, a ronin whose only crime was writing, verses too scandalous for the imperial anthology. Their paths crossed when Narihime's embroidered kimono snagged on a stray branch, her fan tumbling into Saburo's hands. He returned it with a bow so deep his scalp grazed the tatami. "You handle fans as if they carry secrets," he murmured, his tone laced with the arrogance of a man who'd spent too many nights in sake-soaked salons. Narihime, whose repertoire of courtly etiquette usually included feigned indifference, felt her pulse jerk like a startled carp. She invited him to her private pavilion under the guise of critiquing his poetry, but the real test was whether his pen could keep pace with her wit. Their affair was as refined as ink on rice paper, and as dangerous as a misplaced word in a shogun's decree. They exchanged waka in lacquered boxes, each poem a riddle that slipped beneath the nose of her jealous chambermaids. At moonlit dye doors, they shared silk cushions and stolen glances as sabers glinted outside like idle promises. Inevitably, the scandal reached the ears of Fujiwara no Michinaga, the regent whose power peaked with every whispered rumor. He dispatched a retinue of courtly inquisitors, women trained in the art of reading lipstick stains and silk fibers, to hunt down the poet. Saburo, warned by sympathetic gardeners, hid in the bamboo thickets, while Narihime donned a nun's habit to slip through secret tunnels toward Mount Koya. Their escape plan hinged on the emperor's annual procession. They'd blend in with the bearers of incense and lanterns, disappearing into the festival throng. On the day, Narihime's lacquered sandals clicked like distant thunder, and Saburo's borrowed robes swished through crowds of sycophants. But as lanterns bobbed through pine boughs, a single sandal heel snapped. Narihime's scream rose above the drums, pinpointing her position for the imperial guards. Cornered near a koi pond, they faced capture. Saburo, with nothing but his ink-stained sleeve, challenged the head inquisitor to a duel of poetry. Winner takes the poetess. The guards, unused to dueling in haiku, hesitated. 24 lines later, Saburo's final stanza drew tears even from the stone-faced monks. Declared guilty of eloquence rather than heresy, he was exiled to Sado Island. Narihime was confined to a remote convent, her poetry censored into oblivion. Yet legend suggests their love endured. One moonless night, a robed figure set adrift a paper lantern in the temple courtyard, its flame flickering in sync with a distant chant. The chant, some say, was Saburo's farewell, carried on currents all the way to her lonely cell, proof that even 1,000 miles apart, two hearts bound by verse can never truly be silenced. On the windswept shores of medieval Ireland in the crumbling ring fort of County Kerry, Iceland O'Brien was famed for two things: stunning auburn hair that caught sunlight like wildfire, and a tongue sharp enough to carve runes in granite. Betrothed to the chieftain's nephew, an alliance meant to secure cattle pastures, she instead found her pulse racing for Donnacha McConnelly, a troubadour from distant Normandy carrying nothing but a weathered fiddle and a suitcase of dirty jokes. Their first meeting was unfortunate. Donnacha stumbled into the fort's privy while fleeing drunken Flemish mercenaries. Covered in muck and curses, he collided with Aislinn, sending her into a fit of giggles so scandalous that even the stoic warriors paused to stare. Recognizing a kindred spirit in mayhem, Aislinn helped him scrub off the stench, instructing him to bathe in the nearby stream, but only up to his ears, so he'd remember his humbling lesson. That absurd introduction turned into nightly jam sessions, she on harp, he on fiddle, their melodies weaving Gaelic laments with Norman folk tunes. Villagers gathered under torches, entranced by this cross-channel oddity, but the chieftain's family soon demanded an end to Donnacha's influence. The union must be with local nobility, not a foreign minstrel who sang bawdy ballads mocking the patriarchy. Defying her elders, Aislinn orchestrated a midnight escape. They disguised themselves as a pair of wandering fools, their costumes so ridiculous that no one recognized the chieftain's fiery daughter beneath the motley. With a cart of spavined goats and a crate of contraband ale, they set out for the continent under the cover of a raging blizzard, an ironic voyage of liberation powered by goat bleats and fermented barley. Their journey across the Irish Sea was a trial by hypothermia. Donacha's fiddle froze solid, and Iceland's harp strings snapped under the cold. By the time they landed in Wales, they could only communicate in grunts and shivers. Yet somehow, their love flourished amid the absurd trauma. They learned to barter goats for woolen cloaks and warm beds, performing in taverns under the name the Merry Misfits. Despite their best efforts to vanish, the chieftain's mercenaries tracked them to a Welsh border town. Surrounded by a company of angry kinsmen, Iceland dared Donacha to charm his way out with a new ballad. He obliged, his fiddle dancing on the tavern's sticky floor as he sang verses of rebellion, love, and goat-themed insults aimed squarely at the chieftain. By the final chorus, the mercenaries were either laughing or sobbing. None could muster the will to arrest them. Admitting defeat, they returned home bearing tales of Irish audacity and Norman flair, their legends cemented in laughter rather than blood. These turbulent tales remind us that medieval forbidden love was never a matter of soft poems under moonlight. It was a brutal gauntlet of politics, plagues, and perilous pilgrimages. From fiery fjords to silent Kyoto pavilions, from moss-grown ring forts to plague-ridden abbeys, these lovers gambled their lives and reputations for a taste of passion. And though few survived intact, each left behind a legend as absurd as it was inspiring. Proof that when the heart demands defiance, even the sternest customs crack under the weight of desire. Stay tuned for part 4, where we'll venture into the Venetian canals and Persian deserts, uncovering a gondolier's scandalous affair with a silk merchant's daughter that nearly bankrupted 2 navies. In the mist-shrouded waterways of 16th century Venice, love flowed more recklessly than the Grand Canal after a downpour. Marco the Viper Belandi earned his nickname not for venom, but for the way his gondola danced between palatial piers, smuggling contraband and secrets for the Serenissima. One fog-laden evening, he ferried a silk-laden barge alongside the Palazzo Contarini when he caught sight of Isabella Contarini herself, her pale skin glowing in lanthorn light, her dark hair braided with pearls the size of olives. She moved with the noble's grace, but her eyes burned with the yearning of someone suffocated by the gilded cages. Isabella was promised at birth to a powerful dogaress's nephew, a dry old man whose heart had long since ossified into bureaucratic duty. Yet she'd fallen hopelessly for Marco's mischievous grin and defiance of the city's labyrinthine laws. He, in turn, was enchanted by her laughter, which echoed through the gondola like church bells on Easter Sunday. Their first kiss happened mid-canal, as Marco deftly navigated under the Rialto Bridge. Isabella, unable to resist, leaned forward, only for the gondola to jolt on a submerged stone, sending them both sprawling into a pile of coals from the nearby baker's barge. Spluttering and smudged, they laughed until their ribs ached, sealing a bond forged in soot and absurd grace. Their affair blossomed in hidden corners of Venice. They traded letters in the catacombs beneath San Marco, their quills dripping scandalous verses about a gondolier's pride and a noble woman's rebellion. By night, Isabella slipped through masked carnivals in Marco's gondola, blending into crowds of devils and angels, while he whispered promises as grand as the basilica's domes. Yet rumor, ever a hungry stray dog, sniffed them out. A rival gondolier, spurned by Marco's dominance of the smuggling trade, snitched to the Council of 10, hoping to reclaim lost bribes. When Marco's gondola was impounded and Isabella's jewels confiscated, the council decreed she must marry the dogaress's nephew at dawn, or both would face public shaming in Piazza San Marco. With only hours to spare, Marco commandeered a carnival float, an ostentatious papier-mâché gondola painted like a sea serpent, and charged through the canal like a madman in a pageant. Isabella, in full crimson velvet, slid from her balcony onto the float, tearing the pearls from her hair and tossing them into the water as a final gesture of renunciation. The crowd gasped. The council's guards hesitated, torn between duty and the spectacle's delirious romance. They escaped down the Lido at first light, trading Venice's marble palaces for the open sea, For months they roamed the Adriatic on Marco's rickety skiff, surviving on salted sardines and stolen barrels of wine. Isabella learned to navigate by the stars, her pale hands chalked with salt, while Marco bartered favors with pirates and fishermen, each bribe a love token. Yet the council's decree stretched across the Mediterranean. Bounty hunters boarded every ship, their pistols gleaming like justice gone mad. Cornered near the Ionian Islands, Marco and Isabella found refuge in a ragtag flotilla of exiled sailors. There, amid rotting decks and tar-soaked sails, they built a makeshift home, a hovel of driftwood and love-strung lanterns. They married in secret under a crescent moon, exchanging rings carved from driftwood and vows whispered into the roaring wind. But Venice, ever relentless, sent a final emissary, a lone gondolier with a sealed decree and a crossbow bolt tipped in poison. In the darkness, his gondola glided unnoticed alongside their skiff, the bolt flying true, wounding Marco's shoulder and sending him tumbling into the waves. Isabella, shrieking, dove after him, half dragging him back to their ramshackle sanctuary. He survived thanks to her frantic nursing and a rash of leeches sparing his life out of equal parts medicine and irony. They vowed never to return to Venice, their love too fragile to survive marble halls and council edicts. Though they drifted apart in body, Isabella heading east, Marco west. Their letters, folded into oilskin and hidden in fish barrels, crossed paths at sea, each a testament to a bond that even the council's cruelty could not drown. Thousands of miles away, beyond the crumbling walls of Samarkand in the early 17th century, another forbidden romance scorched the desert sands. Layla bint Timur, daughter of a powerful Timurid governor, lived amid silken pavilions and gardens irrigated by qanats. She wore emerald earrings and listened to the clinking of basins filled with rose water. But her heart beat for Ali Qadir, a humble caravan guard entrusted with escorting her father's treasure. Ali, sun-browned and lean from desert winds, wielded a scimitar with the grace of a dancer and the ferocity of a scorpion. Their love ignited during the grand Nowruz celebrations. Layla, bored by courtly parades, slipped away in disguise to mingle with the soldiers lining the caravan's path. There, she spotted Ali performing a daring feat, twirling a flaming torch while riding a steed as black as midnight. When the torch slipped from his hand, Layla caught it mid-air, the flame reflecting in her soft eyes. He bowed, astonished that a noble woman would risk scorching her silks for him. She blushed, returning his bow with hidden laughter. They exchanged glances over saffron-spiced pilafs and clandestine notes sewn into the hems of Layla's skirts. Ali wrote of stars and oases. Layla replied with verses praising his courage. Yet the desert's whispers carried their secret far beyond the caravan. A rival emir, enticed by Layla's dowry of jade and pearls, bribed a guard to spy on Ali's posts. One moonless night, the guard witnessed Layla scaling the wooden ramparts of Ali's tent, her silhouette limb perfect against the flickering lanterns. Her father, upon learning of the affair, was torn between honor and fear. To disown his daughter risked dishonoring the Timurids. To accept Ali risked insult to every noble house. He decreed a cruel compromise. Ali would marry Layla at sunrise, but only if he could cross the desert solo, transporting a chest of gold across 3 mountain passes and back before sunset. Success meant freedom, failure meant execution. At dawn, Ali kissed Layla with the desperation of a man facing death. Then he mounted his camel, laden with gold, and set out across dunes that shifted under the sun's blistering gaze. He dodged sandstorms that blinded like betrayal, wrestled bandits hungry for coin, and navigated ravines echoing with jackal calls. Each trial cost him weight. He bartered gold for water, buried coins to lighten his load, and even surrendered his scimitar to appease a passing tribe. By dusk, he crested the final pass, his camel spindly, his chest nearly empty, and charged down the slope toward Samarkand's minarets, the wind howling praise or mockery, he could not tell which. He returned at the last sliver of sunlight, gasping and unrecognizable beneath layers of dust. Layla, clad in mourning silks and draped in worried shadows, rushed to his side. The governor, witnessing his triumph, wept as he embraced Ali, both out of relief and the sting of paternal pride. The wedding that followed was clandestine but glorious. a feast of dates and pistachios, the music of dutar and rabab echoing beneath the stars. When dawn broke, Layla and Ali slipped away into the desert, their caravan a single wagon drawn by a camel, bearing only a blank chest and two hearts unburdened by gold. These final chronicles of Venetian gondolas and Persian deserts remind us that medieval forbidden love was a currency more precious than pearls and more volatile than spice. Whether in the echoing palaces of Venice or the moon-baked dunes of Samarkand, these lovers gambled their lives against codes of honor, counsels of power, and the capricious cruelty of fate. Some sailed away with naught but driftwood rings and hidden letters. Others outran death itself across mountain passes and storm-tossed seas. And though history relegated their names to whispered footnotes and faded marginalia, their stories endure, proof that in a world ruled by rigid customs and hungry tyrants, the human heart remains the most subversive force of all. Imagine falling headlong into a scandal so juicy that even the monks are popping their corn, only they've run out of popcorn and are gnawing on psalms instead. Today, we're diving into the most notorious medieval lecture hall love story ever, Professor Abelard and his star pupil Heloise. Buckle up, because this affair involves secret letters, castration-level consequences, and a family feud that makes Game of Thrones look like kindergarten. Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we journey to 12th century France, where love was dangerous. Logic was king, and basilica smelled faintly of jealousy. 1. The academic Adonis and the sharp-witted scholar, Peter Abelard, was the rock star of medieval philosophy. If rock stars wore black robes, lived in monastic schools, and traded guitar solos for Latin disputations. By his mid-20s, he'd already sparred intellectually with the greatest minds of Chartres and Paris, earning a reputation for dazzling logic and devilish charm. Enter Heloise d'Argenteuil, a girl genius born into a household that prized genealogy over enlightenment. Her uncle Canon Fulbert, principal of a local cathedral school, had raised her on a strict regimen of holy texts and family pride, resulting in a 12-year-old who could recite Cicero in her sleep and dissect theological arguments faster than an ox falcon dive bombs a rabbit. When Abelard knocked at Fulbert's door, boasting of his mastery of dialectic and promising to tutor the young prodigy, Fulbert thought, finally someone to tame my niece's mouthy brilliance. Little did he know he was unleashing a love hurricane that would blow the roof off his cathedral, literally and metaphorically. 2. Lessons that went off. The syllabus. Abelard's tutoring sessions began innocently enough. Late-night readings of Ovid's Metamorphoses, commentary on Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, and debates so fiery that even the iron candelabras trembled. Heloise, however, had one eye on exotic verbs and the other on Abelard's eyebrows, arched perpetually in that way scholars do when flirting with irreverence. One evening, as Abelard lectured on the nature of divine love, Heloise interrupted, quipping, "Professor, if your logic is as firm as your doctrine, would you prove that love outweighs obedience to God?" Abelard paused mid-syllogism, blinked, then replied, "Let us prove it by experience." Thus began a clandestine correspondence disguised as philosophical treatises, each letter dripping with rhetorical flourish and hidden longing. 3. The culinary courtship. In a world where dinner invitations were the ultimate status symbol, Abelard and Heloise turned mealtime into an intimate battleground. While Fulbert's household dined on spiced boar and stale bread, the lovers traded secret notes in pastry crusts and smuggled kisses beneath steaming tureens. The cook, suspecting nothing, thought the sudden shortage of pomegranates and almonds was market inflation, unaware that every nut and seed was funding a covert romance. They even invented their own language, a mashup of Hebrew, Greek, and flirtatious Latin. Orders for fish became love confessions, while requests for extra gravy meant, "Let us meet in the cloister." The sheer absurdity of their survival strategy, sustaining a scandal on pastry crumbs and wordplay, makes you wonder why medieval dietitians didn't prescribe secret affairs as weight loss programs. 4th family feud level. Epic. When Canon Fulbert discovered love letters hidden in a hymn book, passages like "My mind wanders to your lips as a pilgrim to Jerusalem," he reacted with the fury of a man whose Wi-Fi has just been stolen. He slapped the red private seal on his niece's chambers, stationed guards in the corridor, and attempted to bribe Abelard with a donation to his monastery if he would simply vanish forever. But Abelard, never one to retreat, penned a defiant reply. "Your gold can blind my eyes, but not my heart. Let me see Heloise, or let me die trying." He stormed the school grounds under torchlight, scaling walls like an academic Robin Hood. If Robin Hood wore sandals and wielded a quill instead of a bow, their reunion in the moonlit orchard became legend. Heloise in her nightgown, Abelard in his scholarly robe, both laughing like maniacs as they shed custom and caution for a single combustible embrace. Eindavde, the ultimate sacrifice, in consequence. Their affair reached a fever pitch. Secret baptisms of candles, whispered debates on the ethics of sin, and midnight vows that counted more than any church ceremony. But public scandal was a jealous mistress. Her rumors spread faster than plague rats. Fulbert, sensing his honor unravel, orchestrated a brutal retaliation. Abelard was drugged and castrated by hired men outside Paris. Imagine the horror. One moment you're drafting a treatise on moral theology, the next you're realizing your tuition now covers less. Abelard's survivor guilt was as intense as his shame, but Heloise's reaction sealed their place in history. Rather than flee in disgrace, she entered a convent, partly forced by her uncle, partly by her own will, so she could stay close to Abelard in exile and rewrite the narrative on female agency. Aravde, letters from the abyss, separated by walls but united by intellect and affection. Abelard and Heloise exchanged some of the most moving letters in medieval literature. They argued over faith and reason, chastity and passion, each line a sword play of wit and sorrow. Heloise's letters, in particular, brim with irony. She scolds Abelard for valuing his reputation over her pain, yet confesses that her soul still trembles at the memory of his voice. Their correspondence reveals a world where love and logic collided in explosive ways, proving that even a ruined tutor could still lecture the world on the nature of true devotion. That's part 1 of our deep dive into the illicit affair of Abelard and Heloise, from scholarly spark to savage sacrifice. In part 2, we'll explore how their legacy ignited debates on celibacy, feminism, and the madness of medieval morality, and how their story survived through fire, ink, and endless reinterpretation. See you next time. After the blood-dark night of betrayal, the world awoke to a silence so thick it could snuff out a candle with its heaviness. Abelard lay bleeding in the straw, his mind flickering through a lifetime of logic puzzles and syllogisms that suddenly seemed absurd next to the reality of his new condition. Heloise, her skirts torn and stained by her own tears, cradled what remained of him as though comforting a fallen idol. Their whispered promises dissolved into gasps of pain, and the orchard, once a clandestine cathedral of their love, became a mausoleum for lost innocence. Dragged under cover of dawn into separate cages of destiny, Abelard found himself blindfolded and shackled in a remote monastic cell, the walls humming with psalms he could barely bear to hear. The surgeons of shame had wielded their knives with terrifying efficiency, erasing not just flesh, but the very echo of his masculinity. Each breath stabbed him with a reminder that logic could not solve every problem. Some truths, like pain and humiliation, were immune to dialectical reason. Heloise, forced into an abbey cloister, awoke to the clamor of nuns reciting litanies and the endless scrape of quills across parchment. Gone were the candlelit debates on Ovid and Boethius. Instead, she studied the rule of Saint Benedict and the delicate art of weaving altar cloths. Yet as she knelt upon cold stone floors, her mind refused to be subdued. She translated Abelard's treatises into French for the sisters, annotating margins with razor-sharp commentary on love's injustice. Her sly corrections made the abbess laugh so hard she nearly choked on her hymn book, an act of rebellion disguised as charity. Letters between them became their lifeblood. Abelard's script, once elegant and sure, now trembled with sorrow and suppressed rage. He wrote to Heloise about the paradox of suffering, how a man convinced of God's mercy could still wish for vengeance. She responded not with meek acquiescence, but with scathing irony, reminding him that his own teachings had elevated the dignity of women's reason, and yet she, the paragon of her sex, was trapped behind convent walls. Their correspondence wove a tapestry of intellect and anguish, each missive a gamble that the abbey mail service would not intercept and incinerate their forbidden truth. In secret, Heloise became a force of her own. She taught the younger novices grammar and rhetoric, encouraging them to question the very tenets of their cloistered existence. When the abbess demanded an exposition on the humility of Saint Jerome, Heloise delivered an oration so piercing it left the sisters in tears and the abbess scrambling for her rosary. Rumor spread through the convent that the scholar nun was more dangerous than any heretic, yet even as she flouted tradition, she endured chastisement with a serene smile, her eyes alight with the conviction that survival required embracing absurdity as armor. Abelard, meanwhile, retreated deeper into isolation. He founded a small hermitage, Logres he teased in private letters, borrowing the name of Arthurian legend to lampoon his own fall from academic Camelot. There, he lectured to fellow exiles on the harmony between reason and faith, often ending his lessons with a wry aside. And if my own flesh betrays me, at least my intellect remains intact. His monastery attracted outcasts, former students, and curious clerics eager to witness a man who had gambled his manhood on the altar of love and lived to teach the virtues of pity. Their occasional reunions, clandestine meetings in moonlit barns or hidden forest clearings, were both joyous and grotesque. Abelard, draped in a coarse monk's habit, approached Heloise, whose habit concealed the statuesque figure of the woman who once commanded his full attention. They spoke in whispers, sharing bread and wine stolen from the refectory, their conversation oscillating between tender remembrances and blistering critiques of medieval hypocrisy. Each embrace felt like a triumph over mortality, yet also a reminder that their bodies bore the scars of sanctioned cruelty. Heloise's words in those meetings grew bolder. She challenged Abelard to reconsider the Church's stance on celibacy, arguing that denying natural love only drove passion underground, where it festered into scandal. He admitted that her logic had always been sharper than his. She had bested him in more debates than he cared to count, and now she bested him in the art of living authentically within absurd constraints. Together, they drafted a dialogue on love and law, intending to smuggle it into the wider world as a treatise on human dignity. But fate, true to its medieval form, intervened once more. A wayward messenger lost the manuscript in a tavern brawl, where it ended up being burned for firewood. Years trickled by like candle wax. Abelard aged into a venerable teacher, his hair white as parchment, his laughter still sharp as a newly honed quill. Heloise transformed into abbess of the very convent that once imprisoned her, her authority unchallenged and her wisdom revered. She established a scriptorium where women copied and illuminated classical texts, ensuring that knowledge, like love, could endure beyond the cold decrees of patriarchs. In their later letters, the tone softened into quiet reflection. Abelard confessed that his longing had evolved into something akin to gratitude. Gratitude for having loved so fiercely that he survived the crucible of pain and shame. Heloise, ever the paradox, admitted that her convent had become a haven, not because it offered freedom, but because she had learned to carve freedom out of any cage. They no longer schemed for escape or lamented their mutilated past. Instead, they celebrated the absurd resilience of the human spirit. As death approached, Abelard succumbing to fever in his hermitage, Heloise to old age in her abbey, they exchanged one final testament of their shared journey. Heloise penned a eulogy that cast Abelard not as a tragic lover, but as a hero of reason, whose greatest lesson was that love and intellect are inseparable. Abelard, in his last breath, whispered Heloise's name as a benediction, as though the sound of her name could carry him into eternity. They were buried side by side at Père Lachaise centuries later, a posthumous unity imposed by admirers who refused to let history separate them. Pilgrims leave pens and quills at their graves, symbols of the dialogue that outlived the blade in the convent walls. In the end, their illicit affair transcended its own absurdity, emerging as a testament that love, no matter how forbidden, can become the greatest lesson ever taught. After the tempest of pain and exile, Abelard retreated into the misty forests of Brittany, carving out a hermitage he mockingly dubbed Logres, an Arthurian jest on a fallen king. He lived in a cell of rough stone and damp moss, the air so thick with pine needles it tasted of introspection. Here, free from the glare of Parisian scholars yet shackled by his own reputation, he turned inward. His days took on a rhythm of prayer and pen, At dawn, he labored copying texts. At noon, he lectured a sparse congregation of wayward monks, and at dusk he composed the earliest draft of Sic et Non, challenging the church's authorities with a devilish grin disguised as scholarly rigor. Each chapter pitted scripture against scripture, as though he were jousting with God's own word, forcing readers to choose between blind faith and reasoned inquiry. Meanwhile, Heloise, reinstated at Argenteuil, transformed the abbey from a dusty retirement home for disillusioned nuns into a crucible of learning. She reorganized the scriptorium, recruiting scribes who once served in Fulbert's cathedral school, and teaching them to illuminate manuscripts with marginalia sharp enough to draw blood. She instituted lectures on Aristotle, barely 2 decades introduced in the West, and demanded that novices debate the nature of divine justice before they could master the Psalter. Whenever a visiting abbot balked at her progressive curriculum, she would invite him to a debate in the chapter house, seating him on a wooden bench flanked by excited novices. By the end of the 2-hour disputation, the abbot was either converted to her pedagogical methods or thoroughly humiliated, occasionally both. Their correspondence, once a lifeline of emotion, evolved into a fierce intellectual exchange. Abelard's letters from Logres brimmed with philosophical puzzles. Was divine omnipotence negated by human free will? He constructed labyrinthine arguments, then dared Heloise to find the contradictions. Her replies arrived weeks later, scrawled on worn parchment with flourishes that masked razor-sharp wit. She dissected his logic with the precision of a surgeon, arguing that true love existed only where freedom endured, and that dogma, like orthodoxy, strangled the human spirit. Sometimes her missives included snippets of her own emerging treatise on women's education, an impassioned plea that intelligence was not the sole province of men cloistered in monasteries. In rare weeks when destiny allowed, they met beneath a silver moon in a clearing by the Saloon River. Abelard would hack a rough bench from alderwood and stash it beneath a canopy of reeds. Heloise arrived in a nun's tunic starched so white it almost glowed. Abelard in his coarse habit looked as if he'd been dipped in ashes, yet neither flinched from the absurd romance of it all. 2 exiles finding sanctuary in each other's brokenness, they spoke of theology and tragedy in equal measure, quaffing wine smuggled from Heloise's abbey cellar and nibbling bread Abelard had baked himself, a crystalline irony that a man who taught the cosmos now measured yeast by prayer alone. As years passed, Abelard's hermitage burgeoned into a small school. Simon, his former pupil, arrived with a misshapen lute and an appetite for Aristotle's ethics. Amos, a disillusioned nun, traded her veil for a scholar's cap to debate Abelard on the Trinity. Yet every conversion came with a cost. He watched each disciple leave to join grand cathedrals or noble chapels, carrying his ideas into the world, but abandoning the hermit solitude he'd come to crave. He scribbled notes in his margins, "All roads lead away from the source," and chuckled at his own melancholy pun. Back at Argenteuil, Heloise's abbey became a beacon for intelligent women, countesses disguised as novices, scholars fleeing Parisian misogyny, even a handful of wayward troubadours seeking refuge from mercenary life. She presided over the convent's chapter house like a maestro, orchestrating debates on the nature of creation, urging the younger sisters to memorize Boethius by heart and discuss its relevance to monastic poverty. Her efforts drew scrutiny. An inspecting archdeacon once scrawled heresy in the margin of her rulebook, only to be silenced when she quoted Augustine back at him, verbatim, and offered to lecture the entire clergy on his De Civitate Dei. The archdeacon fled, clutching his pastoral staff like a lifebuoy. Their clandestine visits continued under the same moonlit ritual, though the marks of time deepened around their eyes. Abelard's hair silvered, his robe patched with calls to his former glory. Heloise's hands bore the memory of needle and quill, her posture both regal and knotted with responsibility. Yet in those secret reunions, they transcended age and status, clutching each other as if tethered to life itself. Once, as Abelard recited a new epigram on the folly of earthly power, Heloise laughed so hard she toppled into the reeds, dragging him in. They emerged drenched and muddy, their laughter echoing across the water like a benediction. As the political winds shifted, both endured new storms. A local baron claimed jurisdiction over Heloise's abbey lands, demanding fealty and taxes. Heloise, invoking Fulbert's original endowment charter, stormed into his hall and delivered a 20-minute harangue on canon law so withering that the barons' knights fled, convinced they'd heard the voice of an avenging angel. Abelard, hearing of this triumph, penned her a congratulatory poem in Latin so complex that even his own pupils took 3 days to translate it, but the sentiment rang clear. You, who conquered courtly lords, remain the truest sovereign of my soul. Yet tragedy loomed. In 1142, Abelard succumbed to fever in his hermitage. Heloise received word like a physical blow. One moment she was in the abbey garden, pruning rose bushes. The next the world tore open beneath her feet. She donned a plain tunic, mounted her mare without saddle, and rode through rain and mud to Brittany. She arrived at his bedside too late. Abelard lay still, a thin line of drool at his lips, his hand clutching a scrap of parchment, the final sentence of a sermon he never delivered. Heloise wept, reciting the only vows left to her, those of the heart untainted by ceremony. She remained by his grave until dawn, carving her own epitaph on a rough stone. Here lies Peter Abelard, whose mind was sharp as any sword, whose heart was braver still. May his words outlive these bones, and his love outshine this night. Then she rode back to Argenteuil, carrying with her his final letters, the fragments of his manuscripts, and a silence so profound it reshaped her soul. Back in the abbey's chapter house, Heloise transformed grief into purpose. She read Abelard's lost treatises aloud to the nuns, reconstructing his sermons from memory and embedding her own commentary on the power of compassion. She founded a modest school attached to the convent, welcoming both women and a handful of curious laymen to study philosophy under her guidance. Her reputation spread far beyond Normandy. Scholars arrived seeking the wisdom of the Lady Abelard, as some cheeky students nicknamed her, and bishops covertly sent emissaries to debate her. She met each challenge with the same blend of irony and intellect that had first enamored Abelard. In the final years of her life, Heloise penned a series of treatises on pastoral care and communal living, insisting that monastic walls must not close out the world's suffering, but become conduits for mercy. She argued that the Church's insistence on celibacy had severed the clergy from the texture of human experience, a point she proved by recounting her own love, a story that scandalized even in doctrinal footnotes. When she felt death approaching, she convened her novice chapter one last time, reading them from Abelard's Sic et Non in her own epistle to posterity, urging them to free their minds even as they bound their bodies in habit. Heloise died seated in the chapter house, her quill still poised above an unfinished sentence. Love's logic endures where reason alone falters. Later admirers would compile those scattered works, preserving both her voice and Abelard's in a single volume, an amalgam of dialectic and devotion. They were buried side by side at Père Lachaise, centuries later, but their true resting place remains in the margins of medieval manuscripts in the hearts of those who dare to question. In the end, their illicit affair transcended flesh, becoming an eternal testament to the absurd bravery of loving and thinking against all odds. The sun rose over the muddy banks of the Seine like a wary witness to Abelard and Heloise's final chapter. A world that had once teemed with their clandestine meetings now reduced to empty cloisters and silent groves. Heloise, adorned in the simple habit of an abbess, moved through Argenteuil's corridors with a serenity that belied the tempest in her heart. Every stone seemed to hum with memory, of stolen kisses beneath vaulted ceilings, of whispered debates on faith that had ignited so many sparks. Meanwhile, in Brittany's remote woods, Abelard's hermitage lay abandoned except for a single candle flickering in the scriptorium. The walls, once scrawled with his bold challenges to ecclesiastical authority, stood half empty, as if the plaster itself mourned his departure. Word had come to Heloise that Abelard had fallen ill. Fever, they said, the cruel equalizer of all men, regardless of intellect or station. She would not wait for a formal summons. Wrapping herself in a cloak of coarse wool, she embarked on the 50-mile trek through rain-soaked fields and flooded byways. The journey tested her resolve. Swollen ruts threatened to swallow her mare, and thieves lurked in the hedgerows, mistaking the abbess's remote pilgrimage for a laden purse. She refused to bribe her way past them. Instead, she recited Boethius's consolation under her breath until the robbers, unaccustomed to philosophical discourse, fled in confusion. Arriving at Logres as twilight bled into darkness, Heloise found Abelard propped against a pallet, his gaunt frame trembling with chills. His eyes, once bright with scholarly fire, flickered as he recognized her silhouette. No words passed between them, only the echo of a lifetime weighed in heartbeats. She knelt, pressed a damp cloth to his brow, and he traced her fingers with what strength he had left, as though confirming she was flesh and not memory. They spoke in whispers that night, not of doctrine or debate, but of the simple act of breathing beside one another. Abelard apologized for the cruelty of time that had stolen so much from them, his health, his freedom, their youth, while Heloise laughed softly, chastising him for underestimating her capacity for absurd hope. "I've survived churches," she reminded him, "and conventions more rigid than your finest syllogisms. I can survive this too." In the days that followed, Heloise became healer and scribe. She concocted herbal poultices from the forest's edges, mullein, comfrey, and willow bark, monitoring his fever with a nun's meticulous record-keeping. Meanwhile, Abelard, fever-bathed and delirious, would murmur fragments of lost lectures. Heloise captured each phrase in the margins of her prayer book, preserving his final sermons on the harmony of reason and faith. On the seventh dawn, Abelard awoke, his voice fragile but lucid. "My final thesis," he rasped, "is that to love is to reason beyond reason itself." They spent that week drafting what Heloise would later call the last dialogue, a meditative exchange, on mercy, marriage, and the place of passion in a world ruled by dogma. Their conversation circled familiar themes, divine love, human will, but now carried the weight of impending farewell. Abelard, pale and skeletal, teased that if Heloise abandoned him now, he would haunt her in every marginal note she ever wrote. She pledged to include his name in every illuminated manuscript, condemning him to eternal marginalia. On a cold November night, Abelard slipped away. Heloise held his hand until the spark in his eyes faded into the shadow of the candle flame. She whispered a final prayer in Greek and Latin, then pressed his cold fingers against her heart, a benediction that no church could revoke. Alone in the silence that followed, she discovered both devastation and a strange relief. The logic of grief, she realized, was a calculus of absence, and now she could, at last, begin to learn its proof. Returning to Argenteuil, Heloise carried a wooden chest filled with Abelard's drafts, his half-finished dialogues, and snippets of verse he had never dared sign. The abbey sisters gathered to mourn, their laments echoing through the cloisters like a chorus of displaced voices. Heloise delivered a eulogy that blended scholarly rigor with raw emotion. "He taught us that truth is not a fortress to defend, but a path to traverse, a journey made richer by every footfall of doubt." In the months that followed, Heloise poured her genius into finishing Abelard's works and expanding her own. She composed a treatise, later titled On the Dignity of Women's Reason, arguing that cloister walls should never cage the mind's flight. She wrote instructions for pastoral care that insisted compassion must precede doctrine, and that the church's rigidity often alienated the very souls it claimed to save. Her writings circulated among clerical circles in illegible scripts, copies hidden under hooded cloaks, each copy a testament to her boldness. Argenteuil itself transformed under her guidance. The abbey school welcomed laywomen, widows, merchants' daughters, even a few inquisitive men, offering courses in grammar, rhetoric, and natural philosophy alongside the Psalter and the Breviary. Stone paneling, once inscribed with the rule of Saint Benedict, now bore Hebrew epigrams next to Latin verses, symbolizing the synthesis of faith and reason Heloise championed. Decades passed. Heloise matured into a figure of near-mythic stature. Pilgrims traveled from Chartres and Paris to seek her counsel, some bringing precious manuscripts to be copied, others bearing questions on the nature of conscience and love. Kings and bishops, intrigued by rumors of the lady teacher, sent emissaries to observe her debates with the abbey's brothers. Heloise, ever incisive, met each interrogation with a measured argument, often exhausting her opponents with logic so supple they forgot to accuse her of heresy. When at last she sensed her own end approaching, she convened a final chapter meeting. The novices gathered in the refectory, expectant. Heloise, seated at the head of the long table, gestured to a stack of parchment and quills. "Take these," she said, voice still strong, "and write your own dialogue. Do not fear to question what I have taught you, for truth is a living thing." She paused, her eyes sweeping the room. "Let your questions be sharper than any sword, and your compassion deeper than any text." That night, Heloise retired to her private study, set quill to parchment, and penned Epistola Finalis, a letter addressed to all seekers of reason and love. In it, she recounted her life, the exhilaration of forbidden lectures, the agony of castration and exile, the fierce joy of loving against odds. She concluded with these words: "If history forgets our names, let our thoughts endure. And if history remembers only our folly, may it at least marvel at our courage." She passed away before dawn, her hand still clutching the final draft. The nuns found her at her desk, habit immaculate, quill poised. Among the scattered papers lay a single rose, pressed between the pages of Abelard's Sic et Non, a silent declaration that their hearts remained entwined across time and space. Centuries later, when Père Lachaise cemetery opened its gates, admirers exhumed their bones and reinterred them side by side. Tourists now leave pens, quills, and small parchment scrolls at their shared tomb, tokens of a love and intellect that defied every cruelty and constraint. Their story endures not merely as a scandalous footnote in ecclesiastical history, but as a beacon for anyone who dares to ask, can reason survive passion? Can passion survive reason? And how, in the madness of survival, do we reconcile the two? Thus concludes the illicit affair of Abelard and Heloise, not with a tidy moral, but with the enduring question they taught us to cherish: to reason is human, to love is divine, and to embrace both is our greatest, most absurd act of courage. Imagine sneaking out of your own coronation banquet, heart pounding so hard you're certain every guard can hear it, only to find your secret lover waiting in the stables, cloak pulled tight against the chill and gossip already swirling louder than the trumpets. Today, we're unraveling the wild tales of royal lovers who risked everything for a stolen kiss, a story of crowns exchanged for codpieces, of palace walls echoing with scandal, and of survival in a world where a broken vow meant more than a broken heart. King Edward II of England was supposed to be a stern ruler, a man of duty who wore his crown like a burden. Instead, he wore his affection for Piers Gaveston like a badge of rebellion. When Edward, barely 20, summoned Gaveston back from exile and lavished him with titles and lands, the nobles nearly choked on their beef pies. Here was a king who preferred his favorite companion's laughter over council meetings, and whose private chambers were rumored to be more crowded than Parliament. Gaveston's return sparked furious baronial uprisings. Lords stormed castles, daggers glinted in moonlit corridors, and every nobleman with an axe to grind accused Gaveston of witchcraft, sodomy, or simply being too entertaining for comfort. Behind the palace tapestries, Edward and Piers plotted midnight rides to Windsor, swapping royal banquets for muddy fields where they could whisper freely. They exchanged rings carved from ivory and challenged each other to contests of strength, wrestling matches in the courtyard that ended with both men collapsed in laughter. Yet loyalty within the royal bedchamber meant treachery beyond the drawbridge. The barons, furious at Gaveston's influence, forced Edward to sign the ordinances of 1311, banishing his lover and stripping him of his earldom. But love, like a stubborn weed, sprouts where authority forbids it. Edward defied his own oath, smuggled Piers back into the tower disguised as a royal messenger, and celebrated his earl with a banquet so lavish that the kitchens ran out of swan and resorted to boiled turnips. That extravagance proved Gaveston's undoing. The barons lured him into a staged tournament, then seized and executed him on Blacklow Hill. Edward's heartbreak was as public as his joy had been private. He tore his hair out, cursed his nobles, and withdrew into a state of perpetual mourning. In his grief, he abandoned his kingly duties. Scottish border defenses crumbled, taxes went uncollected, and the realm teetered on the brink of chaos. Through it all, Edward wore his sorrow like a badge of honor, refusing to grant Piers a Christian burial until the Pope intervened, proof that in the medieval mind, love could still outwit logic and leave a kingdom in ruins. Meanwhile, across the Channel in Tudor England, Princess Mary Tudor was sent to France to become queen, and promptly fell head over heels for Charles Brandon and Duke of Suffolk, a handsome courtier of decidedly lower birth. Tradition dictated she marry King Louis XII, a union of political convenience that would secure peace and French wine imports. But Mary, whose only consolation amid stiff court etiquette was Brandon's irreverent jokes and daring horse-riding feats, found the idea of a cold diplomatic marriage more chilling than the Channel winds. When Louis XII died after barely a year of marriage, Mary saw opportunity. Under strict orders to return to England and marry a husband chosen by her sister, Henry VIII, she hatched a plan so reckless it reads like a bawdy tavern tale. By lantern light in a private chamber, Mary and Charles exchanged vows. No priest, no gold rings, just a prayer to God and a shared bottle of claret. Bride and groom sneaked through the palace corridors, disguised in commoners' cloaks, and fled to Brandon's family seat, leaving courtiers bewildered and royal advisors scandalized. When Henry VIII learned of his sister's clandestine wedding, he erupted in a tantrum that shook the tapestries in Westminster Hall. He threatened to disown her, revoke her dowry, and imprison Charles for life. But loyalty to blood ran deeper than political expediency. Henry, ever the pragmatist, saw that opposing the couple risked turning public sympathy into civil unrest. After all, who could blame a princess for choosing love over diplomacy? He relented, demanded a hefty fine from Charles, and pardoned them both, though he never let Mary forget that her jeopardy had strained royal coffers more than any foreign war. Mary and Charles lived out their days in relative happiness, raising a brood of children who grew up masked by their father's fortune and their mother's stubborn dignity. Their affair became courtly legend. Songs were sung of the princess and her jester-turned-duke, and chroniclers praised their devotion amid the cutthroat politics of Tudor England. Yet the absurdity of their survival lay in the quiet. When Mary died in 1533, she left instructions that her heart be buried with Charles, a final act of defiance against the court that had tried to quell her love, from a king undone by affection to a princess who defied her crown. These royal lovers gambled titles and lands for a night beneath the stars. They risked exile, execution, and eternal scandal. Yet in their stories, we glimpse a medieval world where the absurd extremes of survival collided with the wildest yearnings of the heart. Stay tuned for part 2, where we cross the Mediterranean to unearth the torrid affair of Isabella of Castile and her Moorish knight, a romance so deadly it nearly ignited a crusade. When King Ferdinand's court buzzed with talk of uniting Christendom under Castile's banner, few expected his daughter Isabella to risk everything on a perilous venture of the heart. Yet it was precisely that boldness, couched in royal duty and cloaked by political intrigue, that drove her straight into the arms of Ahmad al-Rashid, a Moorish knight turned emigre in Andalusian exile. She first encountered him at the siege of Jerez, where the banners of Castile flapped like hungry wolves. Ahmad, once a respected cavalry commander under the Nasrid emir, had sworn his sword to a band of mercenaries after his homeland fell. Mounted on a coal-black stallion, he cut a strapping figure in scuffed mail and a turban stained by desert suns. Isabella, overseeing the siege works, watched him lead a daring night raid that snatched enemy supplies under the city walls. His audacity earned her grudging admiration, and a spark far more dangerous than flaming arrows. The first meeting was nothing like the sweet encounters of troubadours. Isabella approached Ahmad under the pretense of inspecting the camp's sappers. He met her with the courteous nod of a knight trained at Granada's courts. She introduced herself as the commander's daughter, and he replied that he served no crown but his own honor. Their words were formal, but each syllable carried an undercurrent. Isabella's steel-edged curiosity against Ahmad's measured restraint. In the days that followed, they clashed in discourse as fiercely as in combat. Isabella questioned him on the ethics of mercenary service. Ahmad challenged her on the morality of crusade. Their debates, once public, soon moved to the shadows of the tented pavilions. By lantern light, she probed his memories of Moorish courtly life, and he pressed her on the burden of ruling hearts and lands. Each conversation peeled back layers of obligation until only two souls remained, defying the chasm of faith and blood between them. Their clandestine affair unfolded amid the roar of cannons and the groans of starving defenders. Ahmad smuggled love letters in the stitching of Isabella's habit, verses in Arabic praising her courage as hemmed in Castilian valor. She replied in Castilian couplets invoking Andalusian gardens and the scent of orange blossoms. When spies reported their meetings, Ferdinand ordered Ahmad's arrest. Yet Isabella, feigning illness, summoned her father and demanded clemency for the Moor who had saved her siege engines from sabotage. The king, torn between paternal duty and political prudence, granted Ahmad conditional freedom, so long as he undertook a holy pilgrimage to Rome. That decree would have exiled most lovers into oblivion, but Isabella and Ahmad plotted a bolder escape. Ahmad would desert his mercenary band during the pilgrimage, join a passing Genoese galley, and sail south to Tangier. Isabella would slip across the strait in secret, disguised as a novice nun, and rendezvous with him in the Casbah's shadowed alleys. There, they would carve out a realm of their own, half Moorish paradise, half Castilian court, where faith bowed before the sovereignty of love. Their plan nearly succeeded. On a moonless night, Ahmad vaulted the Genoese galley's rail and swam ashore in Morocco, guided by a handcrafted compass Isabella had sent him. Meanwhile, Isabella donned a woolen habit and pressed her face beneath a linen wimple. Smuggling past royal guards, she crossed the straits in a fishing skiff, clutching her prayer book and a jeweled dagger. At dawn, she set foot in Tangier's harbor, breathless with triumph and terror. Yet fate conspired once more. A jealous sultan, angered by rumors of Christian intrigue on his docks, ordered all foreign vessels detained. Isabella's skiff was seized, her crew imprisoned for espionage. Ahmad, learning of her capture, led a ragtag band of renegade knights in a daring assault on the customs house. They fought through guard towers and across the quay, swords clashing in a symphony of chaos. Isabella, trapped inside a courtyard, watched from a grated window as Ahmad risked his life to breach the gates. When he finally reached her, he bore wounds so grievous that her courage wavered for the first time. She dragged him into a hidden alcove as Andalusian guards thundered down the hall. There, under the arch of carved stucco, she wrapped his bloodied form in her habit and pressed a kiss to his brow, vowing they would survive, or die together. Their rescue proved both spectacular and absurd. A fleet of Castilian galleys, summoned by Ferdinand's desperation, bombarded Tangier's coffers until the Sultan sued for peace. Isabella, returned triumphantly to Seville, defied her father's orders to annul her bond with Ahmad. Instead, she declared their union a sacrament of love higher than any political marriage. Ferdinand, fearing revolt from overzealous clerics, threatened to disinherit her. Isabella replied that she would rather die a Moorish empress than live a Christian princess without freedom. In the end, her defiance reshaped the politics of the Western Mediterranean. Ferdinand relented, granting Ahmad a noble title and lands in Granada's borderlands, an unprecedented concession to a Moor in Castile. Their court became a beacon of cultural synthesis, mosque-style gardens alongside Gothic chapels, Arabic scholarship flourishing beside Castilian troubadours. They hosted poets in 3 tongues, Castilian, Arabic, and Occitan, while ambassadors from Venice and Fez marveled at their harmony. Yet even this gilded exile bore the sting of absurd survival. Isabella, estranged from the Spanish succession, watched her homeland slip toward the Inquisition's shadow. Ahmad, ever a soldier, saw his knights folded into feudal retinues, their fierce independence eroded by courtly ceremony. And though their love endured for decades, each glance bore the weight of dread, the church's wrath, the sultan's envy, the baron's resentment. When Isabella finally died in Ahmad's arms, her last breath mingled tears of victory and regret. She whispered that she had gained the world of love yet lost the realm of her birth. Ahmad, broken in body but unbowed in spirit, commissioned a mausoleum in Granada where East met West in tiled mosaics. There, they lie side by side, a queen in silk robes embroidered with pomegranates, a knight in mail still tarnished by Andalusian sand. Their story became legend among both Christians and Moors, a testament to the absurd extremes of royal devotion, to the cost of crowns shed for a stolen kiss, and to the courage it takes to risk kingdoms for the sovereignty of the heart. In the frosty dawn of 1565, Mary Stuart swept from Holyrood Palace like an avenging goddess, her cloak of ermine trailing behind her on the castle's flagstones, her crown heavier with expectation than any queen before her. She had ruled Scotland since childhood, surviving regents' betrayals, cousins' intrigues, and Catholic plots that fluttered through the corridors like poisoned moths. Now, at 22, she sought a husband, one who would elevate her reign rather than undermine it. The arrangement with France had soured, and Elizabeth's shadow loomed across the border. Mary needed a partner, but fate delivered a man whose ambition matched her own arrogance. Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley. Darnley arrived in Edinburgh with the swagger of a Tudor prince and the complexion of a man unaccustomed to northern winds. Rumor insisted he bathed only in rosewater and demanded his chambers heated by bonfires of oak. Mary, ever drawn to contrasts, saw in him a mirror of her own boldness. He flaunted his lineage, grandson of Margaret Tudor, yet chafed under any notion that he existed to serve a queen. Their first meeting ignited like flint on steel. Mary in velvet crimson, Darnley in satin so fine it might have been woven from gossip itself. He bowed too low, she laughed too loud, and somewhere beneath the court's marble pillars, two hearts began to beat in reckless unison. Courtship in 16th century Scotland meant more intrigue than chivalric ballads. Darnley insisted Mary name him king, a title her nobles balked at, fearing their queen would be eclipsed by her consort's entitled ego. Yet Mary, craving equality more than stability, crowned him anyway in a hastily arranged ceremony at Stirling, his peers forced to mutter assent beneath frost-crusted beards. With his new title came Darnley's demands, a palace wing furnished with tapestries illustrating his own heroic deeds, none of which had yet occurred, and a cell of servants who would address him as Your Majesty, even while carrying his chamber pot. Mary granted these whims, convinced that her iron will could tame even this gilded egotist. But the absurdity of medieval marriage revealed itself swiftly. Nights meant for whispered devotion became sessions of royal one-upmanship. Darnley scoffed at Mary's French music, preferring English madrigals that made her cheeks burn with embarrassment. She retaliated by hosting banquets of exotic fowl and spiced wine, only for Darnley to down them both with such gusto that he fell from the high table, nearly cracking his crown on the flagstones. The court watched in horrified fascination. Here was a queen undone by laughter and a king undone by his own hubris. Meanwhile, Mary's Catholic advisors seethed. They had hoped Darnley's Catholic blood would solidify their power. Instead, he turned Protestant at the first hint of English bribes. Elizabeth's spymasters whispered into his ear, promising him the English succession if he could wrest control of Mary's councils. Darnley, intoxicated by ambition, began plotting with Morton, Elizabeth's Scottish proxy, to sideline Mary's loyalists. He even attempted to bar her from certain meetings, an act so ludicrous that Mary confronted him in the throne room. "Are you king of the Scots or king of your own vanity?" Their argument ended in fury so epic the tapestry of St. Andrew's. Martyrdom was torn asunder by a thrown gauntlet. As suspicions grew, Mary sensed a darker conspiracy. Darnley's servants spilled secrets to assassins in the dead of night, and Mary's physician reported poison slipped into her wine. She resolved to strike back, arranging a rendezvous with James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, another Covenanter exile and rumored master of the blade. Bothwell, scarred and cunning, shared Mary's appetite for danger and disdain for courtly decorum. Beneath the moon at Dunbar's cliffs, Mary and Bothwell swore vengeance. He pledged to restore her sole sovereignty or die trying. Blood oaths were sealed with red wine, and Mary, ever impulsive, agreed to hide her burgeoning fear beneath a veil of desire. Yet Darnley, sensing the net tighten, fled to Glasgow with armed guards. Mary pursued, her retinue littered with Bothwell's loyalists. At Ainsley's tavern, she confronted Darnley beneath a chandelier dripping with tallow. He accused her of adultery, treason, and general incompetence, charges he could ill afford to levy against her if he valued his crowns. Mary retorted by revealing his betrayal. Letters intercepted from Elizabeth's couriers, bribes uncovered beneath his mattress. The confrontation ended with Bothwell bursting in, sword drawn, and Darnley's guards melting away like soaked parchment. Darnley escaped by window, his final indignity fleeing across rooftops in his nightshirt. Revenge, however, demanded greater cunning. In February 1567, Mary invited Darnley to Edinburgh's Kirk O'Field for a masquerade ball, a diversion so absurdly lavish that talk of masked revelers and fireworks spread faster than famine rumors. Darnley, eager to regain Mary's favor, attended in full regalia. But the following dawn, a thunderous explosion rocked the courtyard. Darnley's lodging had been blown apart, rubble strewn like a sacrilegious mosaic. His body was found slumped in an orchard pond, bruised and strangled, his nightshirt stained with both blood and water. The investigation collapsed under a cloud of noble bribery and scapegoating. Bothwell's name surfaced in every whisper, yet Mary defended him publicly, declaring she would marry no one else. This final scandal shattered her reign. Nobles rose in rebellion, Bothwell fled, and Mary, once mistress of 3 kingdoms, found herself imprisoned in Loch Leven Castle. Her world reduced to iron bars and whispered regrets. Mary pondered the absurd gamble of love and loyalty in a realm ruled by temperaments as treacherous as any sea. Darnley's ghost haunted her dreams, magnificent and pitiful in equal measure, while a Bothwell's betrayal cut deeper than any dagger. When Mary escaped and fled to England, she traded one tyrant for another. Elizabeth, her cousin, greeted her with polite cruelty, imprisoning her for 19 years until Mary's execution in 1587 confirmed the folly of royal passion. Half a century earlier, in the aftermath of the 100 Years' War, another ill-fated royal romance smoldered beneath England's Norman palaces. Catherine of Valois, widow of Henry V, was a foreign queen left with a kingdom in turmoil, and a toddler, Henry VI, seated on the English throne. France's nobles clamored for her return, while English lords hovered like vultures, each eager to court the dowager for her lands and dowry. Catherine, fierce and prideful, vowed never to remarry, at least not within the palace walls. But love, like a desert wind, finds its way through the smallest cracks. In 1428, she met Owen Tudor, a Welsh squire of uncertain birth who served the royal household. Owen was known for his boundless energy rather than his lineage. He vaulting after dogs, wrestling boisterous pages, and charming even the sternest ladies-in-waiting with his impossibly broad grin. Catherine first noticed him in the great hall, balancing 3 tankards of mead and saluting King Henry with a bawdy limerick. The court erupted in laughter, and Catherine, drawn to such reckless vivacity, whispered to her chamberlain, "Find me that Welsh jester." Their courtship was clandestine and absurd. Owen slipped notes into Catherine's prayer book, penned in Welsh so her attendants could not decipher them. She replied in French, praising his strength and mild rebellion against court protocol. They courted by torchlight in the palace chapel after prayers. She in widow's robes, he in mail smattered with church candle wax. Each stolen moment felt like a betrayal of crown and custom, yet both savored the peril as an essential spice of their union. Their consummation, so the chroniclers snickered, happened within a barley cart parked against Windsor's outer wall. Owen harnessed the cart's draft horse himself, and Catherine, laughing at her own audacity, clambered into the back. Guards nearing the stable yards caught a glimpse of them amid upturned sacks of grain. Catherine's cloak tangled in Owen's belt, and rushed off to fetch reinforcements. By dawn, the cart was empty, save for hoof prints in the mud, the lingering scent of saffron from Catherine's hidden perfumes. Risk amplified romance. Catherine and Owen married in secret at Hertford Priory, with only a priest bribed by Welsh gold as witness. When Catherine conceived, court rumor metastasized into scandal. A dowager queen bearing a child by a mere squire threatened to undo the social order itself. Henry VI, barely old enough to grasp his regency, signed orders forbidding any romantic liaison, though he later remarked that Owen's cheerfulness brightened the gloom of my father's death. Catherine ignored the decree. She claimed widows' privilege, insisting her first husband's contract allowed her to marry whomever she pleased. Lawyers squabbled, barons protested, and the Privy Council issued contradictory edicts that served only to prolong the farce. When the child was born, Edmund Tudor, future Earl of Richmond, Catherine held him at her breast and dared the world to challenge her maternal right. The King's Council, desperate to preserve stability, recognized Owen as Master Owen Tudor, granting him a modest pension and lands in Wales. Catherine's defiance became legend. The Dowager Queen who wed beneath a thatched roof and birthed the founder of the Tudor dynasty. Yet even as Owen was ennobled and Catherine's smiles softened with contentment, the court's animosity never fully dissipated. Owen navigated royal jealousy with wit and occasional brawls. He slew a baron's prize bull in single combat over a disputed wager, wrestled a French ambassador on New Year's Day over a misdelivered gift, and once challenged a prelate to a drinking contest that ended with the bishop blessing Owen's liver but damning his soul. Catherine intervened each time, smoothing over royal displeasure with a curt smile and whispered, coaxing, her authority now anchored in motherhood in the unbreakable bond of their absurd, risky love. Their idyll lasted until Catherine's death in 1437. She fell ill after nursing plague victims in London, choosing duty over self-preservation as she had chosen Owen over protocol. With her dying breath, she clasped his hand and whispered that her only regret was not living long enough to see their son ascend a throne free of foreign claimants. Owen, stricken with grief yet bound by their creed of resilience, raised Edmund in Wales, steering him toward the Lancastrian cause and ensuring that the Tudors would one day inherit more than laughter and scandal. Thus, two royal affairs, one burning under Scottish castle walls, the other blossoming in Norman halls, revealed the absurd extremes to which love could drive monarchs. They risked crowns, reputations, and even dynasties for a taste of ungoverned passion. And though their choices invited exile, murder, and endless intrigue, their stories endure as testaments to the unyielding power of the human heart, proof that beneath the weight of royal regalia beats the same frantic pulse that drives every lover to just risk it all. In the spring of 1525, whispers of a new power stirred within the stony walls of Greenwich Palace. Anne Boleyn, daughter of a courtier, known more for charm than caution, arrived at court carrying nothing but her laughter and a secret ambition. She had been chosen to serve Queen Catherine of Aragon, but from the moment her dark eyes met the wary gaze of King Henry VIII at a masque in honor of the French ambassador, both courtiers and courtesans knew that something far more combustible than silks was about to unfold. Henry, already 29 and bored with processions of pious matrons, found in Anne a storm-tossed delight. She quoted pagan poets at chapel, teased him with veiled insults about his mustache, a man with such a beard should have stories to match its luxury, and wore gowns so tightly laced that palace physicians suspected she might faint in mid-declaration. When Henry spotted her trailing behind a pageant of lilies, he commanded that she attend him at every banquet and hunt, convinced that proximity would tame the lightning in her eyes. Instead, Anne's sharp tongue sparked contests of wit in the royal chamber, each barb more thrilling than any lance tilt. But Henry was a king bound by alliances. His marriage to Catherine tied England to the might of Spain, and his Holbein-painted portrait hung in princely galleries across Europe. To pursue Anne, he had to sever ties with Rome itself. In whispered councils beneath the painted chamber, Henry declared that his union with Catherine had been cursed by Levitical law, that she had once been his brother's wife, and thus their bed was unlawful. Cardinals shuddered at such blasphemy, ambassadors fainted in their velvet seats, yet Henry dismissed their protests with a wave of his gloved hand, calling Anne the only queen I need. As the king's great matter swallowed chancery seals and sent theologians into theological convulsions, Anne found herself at the eye of a political maelstrom. She bore Henry the crown of martyrdom and the burden of expectation. If she failed to bear him a son, her promise of national renewal would crumble like a clay tile under a merciless hailstorm. Her attendant ladies sneered at her swollen belly. Her sister Mary joked that even a broomstick might serve better as heir. Yet Anne endured the jabs with a haughty tilt of her chin, convinced that her own cleverness could navigate the treacherous shoals of Tudor ambition. When news came that the Pope, besieged by imperial armies in Italy, would not grant a dispensation, Henry resorted to shock tactics. He declared himself supreme head of the church in England, baptizing his reformation with the bloodless stroke of a minister's pen. Monasteries fell one after another. Abbots knelt before him in trembling submission. The clergy, once immovable as granite, recited the royal supremacy oath through parched lips. Anne watched these dramas from her gilded window, her reflection flickering beneath tremulous candlelight. She had unleashed a revolution, and now it threatened to consume her. Their wedding, hastily conducted in the cloister of a converted priory, lacked even the trappings of a proper queenly coronation. Instead of a golden crown, Anne received a circlet of black velvet and pearls, an ironic crown for a woman whose only real claim to power was the king's fickle devotion. Henry feasted in melancholy splendor, toasting his bride with goblets of Spanish claret that drenched the table in burgundy stains. Anne responded with a curt, "I do," her voice steady but her heart hammered with fear that every head turned toward her might be a dagger in disguise. Then came the childbirth. In January of 1534, Anne endured 17 hours of labor in a cramped chamber that smelled of boiled herbs and sweat. When at last she delivered a daughter, Elizabeth, the midwife declared her a weakling, and the courtiers murmured that Anne's pain had been wasted on a girl. Henry, told the news, turned away from the lattice window, his back to the new mother. Yet Anne, swollen and trembling, rose to her feet and announced the child's name with regal dignity, Elizabeth Regina, sending a hush through the assembled nobles. Even if Henry's heart wavered, her defiance lit a spark that would survive far beyond her own peril. The court's obsession with male heirs only intensified the pressure on Anne. Henry's eye drifted toward Jane Seymour, a demure gentlewoman whose subdued beauty offered respite from Anne's storms. Rumors spread of midnight meetings in the palace gardens, of Anne's ladies-in-waiting being arrested on charges of secret liaisons. The king's once ardent letters grew curt, his gifts grew scarce. Anne, consumed by paranoia, had even her favorite dog, Percoy, executed for barking at the wrong messenger. The absurd lengths to which survival drove her became legend. She kept guards posted outside her chamber, hung religious amulets above her bed, and insisted on nightly confessions of loyalty from her own women. In May of 1536, Anne was arrested during a tournament, accused of adultery, treason, and witchcraft, the usual catalog for those who challenged Tudor authority. The charges were as fantastical as they were damning: that she had plotted to poison Henry's dinner, to seduce her own brother for a more exalted betrayal, to employ necromancy in twisting the king's will. Anne's trial, held in the Grand Hall of Westminster, felt like a carnival of shadows. Witnesses contradicted each other, confessions were extracted under duress, and the judges exchanged knowing glances as though they were actors following a well-worn script. Anne, ever proud, refused to beg for mercy. Her final statement, an eloquent defense of her honor, echoed through the rafters, yet fell like stone on the king's cold ear. On the morning of May 19th, Anne ascended the scaffold in the courtyard of the Tower of London. She wore a gown of black taffeta, her hair shorn in a cursory act of humility. The executioner's block gleamed like a monolith of royal justice. Anne placed her head upon the block with a serene grace, her last words a prayer for the king's soul. The sword fell in a single stroke. The crowd gasped, and even the tower's ravens fell silent. Henry buried her in a grave marked only by a simple stone. No epitaph, no crown. Yet Anne's legacy endured. Her daughter Elizabeth would one day ascend the throne, guiding England through its own storms with the iron will she'd inherited. And the church Henry had reshaped in Anne's name would ripple across Europe in unexpected ways. The absurd risks that Anne and Henry had wagered, political revolution, personal ruin, a queen's life, recast the world in startling new forms. Their love, born of ambition and audacity, ended in tragedy. Yet the shockwaves of their reign still tumble through history, reminding us that when royalty gambles with the heart, the stakes are nothing less than the fate of nations. Imagine a queen whose crown weighs heavier than any battle-worn helm, sneaking through moonlit corridors to meet a knight whose honor is as tarnished as the palace brass, and risking both their lives for a single stolen kiss. Today, we're pulling back the velvet drapes on the most scandalous royal rendezvous you've never heard: the Queen and her knight. Brace yourselves for crown juggling, cloak and dagger escapes, and medieval survival so absurd you'll wonder how they lived to tell the tale. The year was 1248, and the kingdom of Evronia stood at the crossroads of ambition and austerity. Queen Isolde I, newly crowned at the age of 20, inherited a realm battered by her father's endless wars and drained coffers. Her counselors saw a frail girl draped in silk and sorrow. She saw a canvas where she must paint her own legend. Behind her regal composure, however, churned a restless spirit. Isolde longed for adventure, for a voice beyond courtly sermons and stained-glass sermons on sin. Enter Sir Tristan d'Aubigny, knight-errant of dubious pedigree and undeniable charm. His reputation rode before him like smoke from a signal fire. Some said he'd saved a baron's daughter from brigands, others that he'd challenged the king's champion to a duel just to prove his blade was sharper. Tristan arrived at Evronia's court in midwinter, his mail clinking like distant thunder, his surcoat patched with mismatched heraldry. He claimed to serve no lord but fortune herself, and had the cheek to challenge the court's finest to tilt against him, emerging victorious each time. The nobles recoiled. Here was a man who treated honor as currency to be gambled, not a sacred bond to be preserved. From the moment Isolde watched Tristan ride his destrier across the frost-bitten green, something inside her thawed. She arranged to observe the tournaments from her dais, her ivory robes brushing the dais' edge as though she, too, could vault into the melee. Tristan, catching her eye above the crowd, saluted with a flourish that sent his visor clattering to the ground, an action so absurd he would later swear he did it merely to retrieve his dropped breastplate. Their first conversation took place beneath the castle's foul-smelling latrine tower, chosen, some say, because neither felt the need for decorum there. Isolde, hood drawn low, challenged Tristan on the ethics of knighthood. He replied with a grin, "Madam, my oath is to the blade, not the throne, yet I find myself strangely bound to your cause." She laughed, a sound so bright it echoed off the dank stones, and thus began a partnership both perilous and preposterous. Over the following weeks, Isolde's courtiers whispered of her secret meetings with the rogue knight. She sent Tristan royal edicts penned in invisible ink, orders to bolster border defenses clandestinely stamped with her seal. He, in turn, passed her intelligence on rival barons, concealed in the pommel of his sword. Their methods were absurdly improvised. Tristan would carve coded runes into the underside of roasted pheasants served at council feasts, and Isolde would smuggle replies hidden within jars of candied plums destined for the knight's quarters. But survival in Evronia required both wit and will. The realm's exchequer lay empty, forcing Isolde to negotiate with Venetian merchants for grain, a feat made possible only by Tristan's daring raid on a Corsican galley carrying illicit spices. He infiltrated the ship disguised as a galley slave, avoiding beatings by reciting bastardized lines from Ovid in a convincing Latin accent. By dawn, the Venetian captain's hold was emptied of cinnamon and cloves, replaced with salted herring and a note from Sir Tristan advising the merchants to accept their new cargo or taste Evronian justice. The shipment arrived in the capital just as the court stores ran perilously low, a victory that earned Tristan both Isolde's gratitude and the ire of the Venetian Republic. Meanwhile, Isolde grappled with the absurdity of being both monarch and mistress of subterfuge. On one occasion, she joined Tristan in full gambeson and helm to repel an insurrection by disgruntled knights, none of course recognizing their queen until she stormed the courtyard and revealed her jeweled crown above her visor. The rebels, panicked by the sight of a crowned knight, surrendered on the spot, convinced that divine intervention had turned a servant into royalty. Isolde later quipped that her taste for swordplay made courtly dances feel like child's play. Yet the greatest peril loomed not from foreign wars or peasant revolts, but from within the palace itself. Lord Regent Malvern, Isolde's cousin and power-hungry protector, began to suspect the Queen's midnight council. He appointed spy-masters to monitor her chambers, eavesdroppers hidden behind tapestry, pigeons trained to peck at messages tied to the Queen's windowsill. Even a court jester bribed to slip truth serums into the Queen's wine. Isolde, always one step ahead, countered with theatrical flair. She staged a mock seance in her solar, complete with smoke and chanting nuns, convincing the spy-masters that her meetings with Tristan were mere apparitions conjured by magic. The jester, racked by guilt and fear of divine wrath, confessed to every plot in a public spectacle that left Malvern's reputation in tatters. In the midst of these absurd stratagems, Isolde and Tristan's bond deepened into something both tender and treacherous. Under the light of a blood-red moon, they shared whispered promises in the fabled rose garden, a labyrinth of thorny hedges where courtiers claimed any who entered were driven mad by the scent. Tristan pressed Isolde's hand to his steel-bound heart. "I would forgo knighthood if it meant forsaking you." She leaned close, the frost of her breath mingling with his, and replied, "Then wear your chainmail no more and follow my rule." Their lips met beneath the roses, petals scattering like confetti over their clandestine union, a moment that would echo in rumor and ballad for generations. But even the fiercest flame must reckon with compromise. Isolde faced a devastating choice when news arrived that neighboring King Leopold of Carinthia, sought her hand in marriage as part of a treaty to save Evronia from ruin. The council demanded an answer by morn, and her heart wavered between duty and desire. She summoned Tristan to the throne room, where he knelt before her in battered armor, a single red rose pinned to his cuirass. She gazed at him, torn between the golden cage of alliance and the ragged freedom of love. Their exchange was brief but searing. Tristan offered her a simple blade, its edge as keen as his devotion. Choose the path of love, and I will carve a new kingdom at your side. Isolde raised the ceremonial scepter of state, her symbol of sovereignty, and then the rose-blooded sword. In that moment, she chose both. She accepted Leopold's alliance to secure Evronia's future, then covertly tasked Tristan with undermining it from within, ensuring that any marriage would remain purely political. Thus began perhaps their most absurd gambit, the queen who wed a foreign king in daylight, and the knight who seduced her heart by night. As dawn broke, the court buzzed with the news of Isolde's engagement. Trumpets blared, ministers inked treaties, and Evronian banners snapped in the morning breeze. Yet beneath the public pageantry lay a secret war of wits and wills. Isolde retreated to her solar, where Tristan awaited with a satchel of forged letters implicating Leopold in treasonous correspondence. With trembling hands, she slipped the letters into the treaty's margins, ready to unleash them when the time was right. Thus ends part 1 of our journey into The Queen and Her Knight. We've seen how Isolde and Tristan's absurd survival tactics, raids on spice ships, masquerades of seances, labyrinthine love letters, wove their destinies together against a backdrop of crowns and conspiracies. In part 2, we'll follow their game of political subterfuge, from secret councils beneath the catacombs to a battlefield ambush that will decide whether love or duty holds the ultimate blade. Stay tuned. The treaty parchment lay open on the oaken table, its margins bristling with royal seals and the faintest smear of ink where Isolde had slipped in Tristan's forged missives. By daylight, her betrothed, King Leopold, would sign away Evronia's autonomy in exchange for Lombard support, but by night the seeds of discord would sprout in his own court. Under the cathedral arches, Isolde convened her secret council. Tristan, cloaked in a courier's guise, the royal scribe Marcellus, whose crooked smile hid loyalties deeper than any dungeon well, and Dame Elsbeth, a lady-in-waiting skilled in poisons and pious obfuscations. No candles were lit. The only illumination came from the moon's reflection glinting off the marble floor. Isolde watched that silver edge flicker as though the stone itself whispered betrayals. "Leopold's emissaries arrive at noon," she murmured. "We have hours to sow doubt." Tristan unsheathed the red-stained correspondence. "These letters implicate his treasurer in embezzlement," he said, voice low. "If we plant them among his advisors, suspicion will peel away their unity faster than plague." Marcellus bowed, already tucking a billet into the folds of his cloak. "I know a clerk in Leopold's chancery who will not question a royal courier." Elsbeth produced a small phial of violet tincture. "If words fail, a poisoned cup at the feast will ensure distraction," she offered. Isolde's eyes narrowed. She preferred chaos to outright murder, yet under Leopold's thumb, more drastic measures might prove necessary. As dawn's first pink bled through the windows, Isolde donned the facade of compliance. In satin and pearls, she greeted Leopold beneath banners proclaiming unity through matrimony. His smile was cordial, if forced. His eyes lingered on her jeweled collar as though deciding its value. The treaty lay curled in her hand like a venomous snake. At the banquet that followed, trumpets announced a procession of dancers in Venetian masks. Isolde watched from a raised dais while her spies, the jester, the falconer, and a retired executioner, mingled with Leopold's retinue. Each carried a discreet token from her council, a folded letter, a drop of tincture, a word whispered in the ear. Tristan, disguised as a banner-bearer, slipped behind the treasurer, guiding him toward the wine table. As the man raised his goblet, Marcellus intercepted, offering a clay mug, commissioned by the queen. The treasurer drank deeply, his cheeks flushed, his words slurred. Murmurs rose. He stole from the crown. "By God, he's drunk!" The mask of unity cracked. At that moment, Leopold rose to rally his court, but found himself surrounded by bitter whispers. "Our coffers emptied and you stand idle?" demanded one baron. Another accused the treasurer of cows mortgaged to distant merchants. Leopold's face blanched. The treaty scroll slipped from his grasp. Isolde caught it before it touched the floor and raised it high, feigning shock. "Are these the hands that serve Evronia?" Pandemonium erupted. Noble ladies fainted, trumpets blared off-key, and Leopold's advisors pointed fingers like accusing daggers. In the chaos, Tristan slipped away to the stables, where a band of mercenaries loyal to Isolde awaited with saddled steeds. That night, Isolde conducted a midnight ceremony in the Rose Garden Labyrinth. She and Tristan moved beneath the thorned hedges, where perfumed statues wept petrichor tears. With each step, she laid down a rose petal, one for every vow she intended to break. Their whispered oaths wound around the twisted paths as though the roses themselves bore witness. "Tomorrow," Tristan vowed, "we strike at Leopold's supply lines. No grain, no allies. His armies will starve before noon." Isolde pressed a parchment into his hand, the plan drawn in charcoal. Sabotage of the mule trains carrying imperial grain from Tyrol. She traced the route with a slender finger, marking the ambush point at Raven's Pass. "Ride with haste, my knight. Evronia's fate rests on your blade and your cunning." By dawn, the castle guards found her chambers empty except for a folded note. "Forgive me, my king. I marry my country to herself." Unable to locate the queen, Leopold erupted in fury. He dispatched his personal guard, 8 armored knights known as the White Falcons, into the rain-soaked streets of Evronian villages. Their mission, capture Isolde alive. Meanwhile, at Raven's Pass, Tristan awaited beneath soot-dark pines. As the Tyrolean convoy lumbered into the narrow gorge, he signaled his men. Torches flared, horses bayed, and the road was blocked by felled trees. Guards drew swords mid-step, only to find themselves surrounded. Within half an hour, grain sacks were looted, wagons burned, and the surviving drivers fled into the night. Tristan hoisted a sack of barley aloft, his laugh echoing off stone walls. "Let that feed befit our monarch's appetite." Back at the palace, Leopold learned of the disaster. His rage boiled over. He mustered an army of 1,000 men, vowing to hunt down the traitor queen and her band of rebels. Evronia braced for civil war. Isolde used the lull to shore up her defenses. In the palace armory, she inspected crossbow bolts dipped in carrion juice, a weapon to spread disease among besiegers, and oversaw the forging of masks etched with her portrait, to be worn by spies and saboteurs. She penned new missives to neighboring princes, promising trade concessions in exchange for safe passage should Evronia fall. Her sacrifices were absurd in their pragmatism. Mirrors were shattered to prevent eavesdropping, black gowns worn by kitchen staff to signal traitors, and nightly curfews enforced only for nobles. Commoners were free to roam, keeping suspicious eyes off the real conspirators. When Leopold's bannered host appeared on the horizon, a gray tide of steel and lance tips, Isolde ascended the battlements. Wrapped in chainmail under her silk surcoat, she raised her sword for all to see. "My people," she cried, voice carrying across the fields, "you have known famine and deceit, but never have you known a ruler who fights as one of you. I stand not above you, but beside you. Rally to your queen, and your enemy shall taste nothing but dust and regret." Her speech, part oration and part battle hymn, ignited the hearts of the townsfolk. Blacksmiths laid down hammers to take spear in hand. Bakers vaulted ovens to stand at the wall gates. Even the young page boys brandished cudgels branded with the royal crest. A motley militia formed under Isolde's command, ready to defend their homeland against Leopold's professional knights. As dusk fell, forces clashed on the plains outside the city, knight on knight, crossbow bolt against pike. Horned helmets glinted as both sides struggled for advantage. Tristan led the queen's vanguard, charging into the fray with reckless fervor, and always emerging with at least one noble's head at his knee. Meanwhile, Isolde directed troop movements from a makeshift war tent, her strategic genius shining in the glow of lanterns. She ordered a feint to draw Leopold's flank into a marsh, where men sank ankle deep, losing formation and momentum. Tristan's reserves then struck from the rear. turning ordered ranks into a panicked rout. By midnight, Leopold's host fled back across the border, leaving behind banners, weapons, and a wounded ego. The night air trembled with the sound of Averonian cheers, and with the distant laughter of a queen and her knight dancing under torches in the ruined field, their crowns and helms strewn in the grass as they celebrated a survival born of absurd valor. The dawn after the Battle of Raven's Pass rose brittle and gray, the field still littered with broken lances and discarded pennons. Queen Isolde stood ankle-deep in trampled grass, her silk surcoat splattered with mud and blood, but she bore a triumphant grin rather than regret. Beside her, Tristan d'Aubigny knelt beside a fallen standard, plunging his dagger into the cloth and tearing it free from its wooden staff. He held the tattered fragment aloft, the golden lion of Leopold's house now a ragged emblem of his defeat. The queen strode forward, her boots crunching shards of shattered armor, and caught Tristan's eye. No words were needed, their shared exhilaration was louder than any battle cry. Yet even in victory, Avronia's struggle was far from over. News of the rout spread swiftly. Villagers emerged from their hovels to strip broken weapons, while refugees from outlying towns poured toward the capital, seeking shelter behind its walls. Supplies were scant, and the jubilation of victory risked being snuffed out by hunger and disease. From a hastily erected dais of supply crates, Isolde addressed her weary soldiers. She spoke of honor, of freedom, and of the absurd promise she had made to her people, that a queen might bleed alongside her knights. When she stepped down, Tristan caught her arm. "The people will need bread more than words," he murmured. So instead of further orations, they organized a makeshift forage. Cavalry detachments and footmen scoured the surrounding countryside for grain and livestock. The royal scribe Marcellus led a contingent upriver to barter with fishermen, trading chandeliers looted from enemy camps for fresh fish. Dame Elsbeth's alchemical knowledge came into play too. She converted surplus wheat husks into a coarse flour that, when mixed with dandelion root and forage berries, formed a gritty porridge sufficient to stave off starvation. Meanwhile, Leopold himself, humiliated but unbroken, retreated to his own fortress, dispatching envoys to neighboring lords to secure fresh levies. Isolde anticipated this move and countered with her own diplomatic outreach. She summoned the ambassadors of Valoria, a minor principality whose princes had historically tilted with the stronger side. In Avondale Hall, she greeted them not as supplicants but as equals. Clad in a leather jerkin borrowed from one of Tristan's squires, she poured wine from a battered flagon and regaled them with tales of Avronia's defiance. When the Valorian envoys responded with polite skepticism, Isolde produced a scroll bearing the crest of their own house alongside Avronia's, sealed with her personal signet. "I have written to your duke," she explained, "offering his daughter's hand to my heir, binding our futures as tightly as this cord." Each word was measured for maximum impact. A marriage alliance was more potent than any sword. The envoys departed convinced that support for Isolde would secure their prosperity, tipping the delicate balance in her favor. Back in the castle, Isolde's nights were spent poring over dispatches with Tristan by her side. They devised covert raids to disrupt Leopold's supply lines further, ambushing timber caravans bound for his siege engines and ransacking hay stores intended for the enemy's cavalry. On one such operation, Tristan led a daring infiltration of a supply depot disguised as a traveling troubadour troupe. He performed off-key ballads while his men slipped behind the stack of fodder, lacing it with mustard seed and crushed garlic to render it virtually inedible. The next morning, Leopold's horses balked at the feed, and his cavalry was rendered ineffective for days. At court, Isolde wielded her popularity like a blade. She hosted lavish feasts for common soldiers and peasants alike, seating them at long tables draped with cloth of gold remnants, and invited the nobility to dine quietly in separate chambers on stale bread and cold broth. Murmurs of Queen of the People swelled among the masses, further undermining Leopold's prestige. When a delegation of barons pressed Isolde to curb her populism, she simply smiled, replying that a ruler must know the texture of mud on her boots before commanding a chase. Their objections dissolved beneath the weight of her wit, yet the cost of survival was never far from her mind. Intelligence reached the queen that Leopold had hired assassins from across the border, the notorious Black Falcons who killed for coin rather than cause. Isolde and Tristan laid their own traps. They dispatched dawn patrols to intercept black falcon riders, turning them into prisoners rather than victims. Those men, haircut into disgraceful shorn braids and chained in the dungeon, provided valuable information about Leopold's next moves. One such revelation was a planned night sortie, a stealthy search and destroy mission targeting the Queen's headquarters. To forestall this, Isolde orchestrated her grandest farce yet. She arranged for her own chambers to be discovered in disarray. Furniture overturned, tapestries pulled down, silverware scattered. An illusion of a surprise raid success. Then, at the precise hour, she vanished with Tristan and a handful of trusted guards into the catacombs beneath the palace. Using ancient tunnels once used by her father, they emerged behind Leopold's encampment. By torchlight, they scaled the outer palisade and slashed the saddles from mounted lords, releasing horses into the night. The sudden clattering of hooves and frightened neighs stirred panic, while Queen Isolde and Sir Tristan, clad in black and moving like shadows, sabotaged wagons and set brush fires around the siege lines. When dawn broke, Leopold's camp was a ruin of smoldering debris, his banners lying trampled in the mud. His men fled once more, cursing the witch queen who haunted their dreams. As months turned into seasons, Avronia's position stabilized under Isolde's rule. She convened a grand council in the renovated Great Hall, sunlight streaming through newly commissioned stained glass windows depicting her victories. Noble lords and foreign envoys alike gathered, anticipating her surrender under the weight of war fatigue, only to find her ready to negotiate from strength rather than desperation. She offered terms of reconciliation. Leopold would renounce claims on Avronia in exchange for a secure border and a formal dowry in currency rather than land. The treaty was sealed with mutual handshakes rather than signatures, each chamberlain placing his sword hilt to the quill instead of parchment. With peace temporarily restored, Isolde turned her attention to domestic renewal. She established guilds to rebuild war-ravaged towns, commissioning artisans to carve likenesses of Sir Tristan smiling beside the Queen, a daring visual statement of their partnership. She reformed the tax code to ease burdens on smallholders, instituting a levy on luxury wines and imported furs that funded public works, bridges, aqueducts, and the richly tiled Great Library of Evron. Hidden in its vaulted corners were secret cubbyholes, where Isolde and Tristan stowed their private correspondence, preserving their shared legacy away from prying eyes. Yet even as Avronia flourished, the personal cost of their survival weighed heavily on the lovers. Tristan, once a roguish knight craving glory, grew restless in the trappings of court life. He found himself donning velvet doublets instead of mail, reciting poems in candlelit salons rather than issuing commands on the battlefield. His hard-won scars itched beneath layers of finery, and he often slipped away at dawn to ride alone through the forest, seeking the clarity of open sky. Isolde, for her part, bore the crown's burden with an iron grace. Yet each evening she closed herself in her study, the reflection in her polished steel mirror fragmented by fear, that her alliance with Tristan would one day unravel into betrayal. She remembered the blood on their hands, the lives they had gambled, and wondered whether love could withstand the weight of history. In those solitary hours, she would pore over letters from her people, thank you notes from village elders, pleas from orphans whose parents had served in her armies, petitions from scholars seeking patronage, and find renewed purpose. Their clandestine romance continued in stolen moments, candlelit dinners in hidden gardens, whispered sonnets in the rosebush arbors, and midnight dances in abandoned towers. Each embrace was tinged with urgency, for they both knew that peace was fragile, and that courtly gossip, once ignited, could burn the brightest fires. Isolde devised a clever signal, a single candle lit in the eastern window, indicating that Tristan should cross the drawbridge alone, bearing only his cloak and a cryptic message sealed with her blood-red wax. One evening, that signal flickered at the hour of vespers. Tristan crept through moonlit corridors to the Queen's solar, where she awaited in a simple shift of white linen, her crown set aside on the desk. They spoke in low tones of the future, of children they might never openly claim, of coronets carved with half-hidden walnuts to mask royal lineage, of a life beyond the walls they had fought to preserve. Yet before dawn, as must always be the case for lovers in peril, They parted, each wrapping memories around themselves like armor. The final test of their bond came when Leopold, 18 months after his defeat, rallied fresh allies in the eastern duchies, convinced that his political marriage to Evronia's nobility granted him a rightful claim to the throne. His army marched once more toward the capital under white banners strewn with golden lilies, a stark challenge to Isolde's rule. Spies reported that he intended to execute Tristan publicly on the palace steps, using his death to cow the populace into submission. Isolde's response was audacious beyond belief. She hosted a grand tournament in the palace grounds, announcing in the notice boards that the victor would be granted an audience with the queen herself. Knightly champions from across the realm arrived, eager to compete for favor. Among them appeared Sir Tristan, disguised beneath a helm and wearing the crest of a minor barony. No one recognized his lithe silhouette until the final tilt, when he unhorsed the vaunted Duke of Montclair with a single expertly placed lance strike. As he removed his visor, gasps rippled through the crowd, the queen's own champion revealed. Isolde, seated upon a dais draped in white damask, rose and descended the steps. She took Tristan's gauntleted hand and kissed the back of it as though welcoming a long-lost hero. Then, in a voice clear enough to carry beyond the walls, she addressed the assembled throng. "This man is my knight in war and in peace. To slay him is to slay the heart of Evronia." Murmurs of dissent were drowned by the roar of approval. Even the Montclairs, humiliated but unbowed, knelt and swore fealty to Isolde afresh. When the trophy, Tristan's broken lance, was offered to Leopold's herald, she refused it, instead passing it to the Chief Justice with an order to codify Tristan's role as protector of the realm. Leopold's army, now leaderless and demoralized, halted at the city gates. Envoys from both sides arranged a parley in the Hall of Echoes, where past treaties had been signed and broken. Isolde entered not with heralds or guards, but with Tristan at her side, his mail beneath a plain surcoat, his hand resting on the hilt of a sword he would never draw against her people. Leopold, face wan and stiff with pride, offered terms of peace, this time acknowledging Isolde's sovereignty and granting Tristan a fief in perpetuity. Thus, during that tense parley, the queen and her knight sealed Evronia's future, not through parchment and seals, but through the absurd spectacle of love amidst power. Their secret affair, once hidden beneath rose petals and coded letters, became the kingdom's cornerstone. Their unconventional alliance, of silk-clad monarch and battle-scarred knight, redefined what it meant to survive in a world ruled by crowns and blades. And so, at the close of that chapter, the court of Evronia settled into an uneasy harmony, with Queen Isolde reigning at dawn and Sir Tristan guarding the dusk. Their love, tested by war, subterfuge, and the knife's edge of politics, endured as the realm's most unlikely bulwark, proof that in the theater of power, the absurd courage of the heart can shape the course of history. The dawn mist clung to Evronia's ramparts like a shroud as news spread of Leopold's last surrender. Queen Isolde and Sir Tristan stood together on the battlements, the city sprawling below them in a tangle of rooftops and church spires. The feast halls would soon explode with celebration, trumpets heralding their triumph. But in this silent moment they allowed themselves a private victory. The realm was theirs, their people safe, and their love no longer a secret. In the great hall, long tables groaned beneath platters of roast boar and flagons of honeyed wine. Commoners sat alongside nobles, each raised goblet echoing the queen's recent decree. All who had fought for Evronia would share equally in its spoils. Tristan, resplendent in surcoat embroidered with the queen's lion and rose device, moved through the crowd, clapping shoulders and accepting cheers with a wry grin. Isolde, crowned anew with a circlet of silver roses, watched him from her dais, her eyes shining with equal parts pride and mischief, ever aware that it was his blade, his wit, and his willingness to love beyond protocol that had saved her kingdom. Music swelled as minstrels struck up a new ballad, The Rose and the Lion, celebrating the knight who bridled his destiny to the will of his queen. The dancers whirled in colorful silks, and for a moment, courtly intrigue was forgotten under the spell of laughter and light. Yet beneath the revelry lay the persistent hum of responsibility, treaties to ratify, borders to patrol, and a treasury still stretched thin by years of war. They would not rest long. The next morning, Isolde convened her council in the Solar, once haunted by betrayal and subterfuge. Marcellus presented the latest reports. Grain stores were replenished, but roads lay ruined. Towns eager for royal patronage awaited rebuilding, and pockets of resistance, remnants of Leopold's loyalists, still smoldered in the remote borderlands. Dame Elsbeth offered remedies, medicinal herbs to stem the plague that followed sieges, and a network of couriers to carry royal directives swiftly across the realm. Tristan, seated at the queen's right hand, recommended forging a new order of knights, loyal only to Avronia's throne, sworn on both faith and love. Isolde nodded approval, seeing in the idea not only a means of defense but a symbol, that the bond between monarch and subject, once sealed in blood and iron, could also be anchored in shared ideals. Over the following months, Avronia blossomed into a haven of rebuild and reform. Villages, once on the brink of starvation, received relief supplies. Artisans were commissioned to repair churches and marketplaces, and the great library's completion signaled Avronia's emergence as a center of learning. Scholars from distant lands arrived to share knowledge of astronomy, medicine, and philosophy, welcomed by Isolde herself in the hall, where she once hid letters and jarred plums. Under her patronage, the scriptorium produced illuminated manuscripts that blended Gothic visuals with rosé motifs, a tribute to the Queen's emblem and a subtle nod to the partnership that had ensured the realm's survival. Sir Tristan, too, found purpose beyond the battlefield. He oversaw the training of the new Avronian knights, instilling in them the code he had learned through hardship, that true honor required empathy, that strength meant protecting the weak, and that loyalty extended beyond bloodlines to encompass all who called the Queen their liege. His reputation grew as both champion and educator, his rough humor tempered by an unexpected gift for mentorship. In time, the Order's standard, a gold lion clutching a red rose, became a reassuring sight on distant roads, promising safety to merchants and pilgrims alike. Their personal lives, however, remained threaded with the absurdities of their station. With peace at hand, Isolde entertained the idea of heirs. Twice she conceived, twice tragedy struck, the first child born prematurely, the second claimed by fever. Throughout her labor and her grief, Tristan never left her side, holding her hand and quelling her anger at fate's cruelty with gentle reassurance. Court physicians marveled at her resilience. The people prayed that the Queen, who had already given so much, might find some gift in return. In the third year, in candlelit silence, Isolde gave birth to a daughter. The child's cry echoed through the hall, banishing ghosts of lost hope. Tears streamed down the Queen's cheeks as Tristan knelt to behold the newborn's lidded eyes. They named her Aveline, Little Bird, hoping she would soar above the storms that had buffeted her parents. Aveline's baptism became a grand event. Envoys from Valoria and Lombardy arrived bearing gifts of silver and silk, and even Leopold sent a solemn apology, acknowledging Isolde's enduring grace. In her christening gown of white damask, Aveline became a living emblem of peace, a promise that love, however tested, would endure. As Aveline grew into a lively child, curiosity sparkled in her eyes. She would slip into the scriptorium to watch scribes at work, follow Tristan on falconing expeditions, and inquire of Dame Elsbeth about her mother's secret potions. Isolde permitted these escapades, believing that the next generation must learn not only of courtly refinement, but also of the realm's fragile history. She wrote treatises on governance that incorporated lessons from her own life, the necessity of mercy, the power of unity, and the wisdom of tempering authority with compassion. Their twilight years brought new challenges. Aveline's betrothal negotiations with a neighboring prince threatened to revive old rivalries. Merchant guilds demanded trade autonomy that could undermine royal revenue, and whispers of succession dispute surfaced whenever the Queen and knight traveled abroad. Yet Isolde and Tristan faced each issue as they always had, together, with a blend of strategic cunning and irreverent humor. When the prince's envoy balked at their daughter's insistence on accompanying her parents to council meetings, Isolde quipped that no man could command Avronia's throne without first winning her daughter's approval. The envoy, disarmed by the child's bright laugh, agreed to a match that allowed Aveline an active voice in state matters. In the final years of their lives, Isolde and Tristan retired from the front lines of governance. They settled in a manor on the outskirts of the capital, where olive groves shaded a small villa adorned with rose trellises and watchtowers converted into libraries. Aveline visited often, bringing her own suitor, a young knight trained under Tristan's order, to learn from the pillars of her family's legacy. Isolde spent her mornings in the gardens, tending roses and reflecting on the journey from reluctant monarch to revered matriarch. Tristan, his hair flecked with gray, resumed his early love of wandering, walking forest paths at dawn, observing birds in flight, and composing poems that captured the quiet beauty of a kingdom at peace. When Isolde fell ill in the spring of her 62nd year, her reign spanned nearly 4 decades, an era defined by resilience, reform, and the improbable union of a queen and her knight. Tristan stayed by her side, reading to her from the earliest scriptorium volumes, sharing memories of moonlit gambesons and rose-laden labyrinths. On her final evening, as twilight bathed the villa in roseate hues, she turned to him and whispered, "I would choose every thorn again if it led me to you." Tristan, holding her frail hand, replied, "And I would bear every wound for one more dawn, with you." She closed her eyes, a gentle smile gracing her lips. Tristan survived her by only a few months. His passing was recorded in the annals as the death of the last rose-bearer, a knight who had lived by the Queen's creed and ended his days in the villa's rose garden, beneath the very trellis where their love had first safely blossomed. Aveline, now queen in her own right, oversaw their joint burial in the royal mausoleum, a tomb hewn in volcanic stone, adorned with carvings of rose vines and lions' heads. Their effigies lay side by side, Isolde in a jeweled gown, Tristan in chainmail, eternally bound in marble as they had been in life. Generations later, historians would debate whether Evronia's golden age arose from strategic acumen or from the sheer absurd bravery of one queen and her knight. Poets would still sing of the secret rose messages and the midnight raids, of court seances and pig-laden feasts, of battlefields reclaimed by love. And children, learning their kingdom's history, would press their palms to the mausoleum's cold stone, hoping to catch a spark of the courage that had shaped a nation. In the end, the story of the queen and her knight became more than legend. It became a guiding myth for all who ruled or dreamed of rule. Their partnership, born in secrecy, tested in war, sanctified in love, proved that survival in a world of crowns and blades required not only steel and diplomacy, but also a willingness to wager one's heart on the chance that love, however absurd it might seem, could indeed change the fate of kingdoms.